The stage from Colton Wells didn't slow down. It stopped hard, the driver hauling the reins like he was angry at the horses, the wooden wheels grinding into dry red dirt and throwing up a small orange cloud that drifted sideways in the October wind. Eliza Mercer climbed down without waiting for help. She wasn't the kind of woman who waited for help. That wasn't pride. It was simply the way she'd been made, shaped by years of making do, of learning early that the hand extended toward you sometimes wanted something back. She stepped onto the ground and felt the weight of the valley settle over her shoulders like a second coat, black hollow. That was what they called this stretch of land tucked into the eastern crease of the Harlan Mountain Range, where the hills folded together like old hands and kept the wind out most of the year, except when it decided to come through anyway, cold and cutting and without apology. Even in October, with the aspens still holding their gold, there was something about this place that felt like the end of something, like the edge of a map. She was 18 years old. She had traveled 6 days by rail and 2 by stage. She had 43 cents left in her coat pocket, a small leather bag containing everything she owned, and a bundle of letters tied with a piece of twine. Letters written in a careful, measured hand by a man she had never met. A widower named Gideon Hale, who needed a wife to help work his ranch and raise his children, because the alternative, she gathered from reading between his careful lines, was watching everything his family had built fall apart, one fence post at a time. She had written back. Carefully, truthfully. She told him she was strong, that she could cook and sew and ride, that she didn't frighten easily. She hadn't told him she was frightened right now. The stage driver tossed her bag down without a word and clicked his horses forward before she'd even fully moved out of the way. She watched the coach roll on down the rutted road, heading deeper into the valley toward whatever passed for a town out here, and then she turned and looked at the ranch. It was not what she'd imagined, which wasn't exactly a surprise because she'd learned by now that the pictures you build in your head from other people's words are almost never right. But she'd expected something solid, something that at least tried to look cared for. The main house was 2 stories, built from dark timber that had weathered to the color of old bone. It needed paint in the worst way. Strips of it were peeling from the window frames like dead skin, and the porch railing on the left side had pulled loose from its post and leaned outward at an angle that made her uneasy just looking at it. The barn behind the house was larger than she'd expected, newer looking, and in better repair than everything else, which told her something about where Gideon Hale put his priorities. 2 smaller outbuildings stood off to the right, and a chicken yard stretched behind a low wire fence, the birds inside moving in their slow, stupid circles. The land itself was something else entirely. Even through the October chill, even through the tired, end-of-season quiet, she could see what this valley must look like in summer. The wide green meadow running down toward a creek that glinted silver at the bottom of the slope. The dark hills rising behind. The sky above them so wide and blue it almost hurt. It was beautiful in the way that difficult things sometimes are. The way a scar can be beautiful once it's healed clean. She picked up her bag and started walking toward the gate. She made it about halfway up the dirt path when she heard the screen door bang open. 3 figures appeared on the porch. 2 were children, a boy of maybe 12 or 13, tall and narrow-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a girl several years younger, small and solemn-faced, watching Eliza with the unblinking attention of an animal deciding whether or not to run. The 3rd figure was a man. It was not what she'd imagined either, though she supposed she should have stopped imagining things by now. Gideon Hale was not old. She'd thought, from the letters, from the measured way he wrote, from the word widower and everything it carried, that he'd be older. 40, at least. Maybe more. He was perhaps 33, 34. Tall. The kind of built that comes from actual work and not intention, with wide shoulders under a canvas work shirt and forearms that had seen weather. His hair was dark with threads of early gray at the temples, and his face was, she searched for the word and found it, closed. His face was closed. Not cruel, not unkind, but shut tight, like a house where someone has drawn all the curtains, and you can tell there's light inside somewhere, but you can't quite reach it. He stood at the edge of the porch and looked at her. She stopped at the gate and looked back at him. Nobody said anything for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Then he came down the porch steps. He had a slight hitch in his left leg. Not a limp exactly, more like a memory of one. An old injury that hadn't quite finished healing or hadn't healed the way it should have. He walked to the gate and opened it and looked at her bag, then at her face. Eliza Mercer, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Another pause. His eyes, dark brown, she noticed, the color of river water in the shade, moved over her in a way that wasn't rude, just assessing. Like she was a fence that needed mending and he was trying to figure out what kind of work it would take. You're younger than I expected, he said. You're younger than I expected too, she said, and then immediately wished she hadn't because his expression didn't change at all, and she couldn't tell if that was good or bad. He picked up her bag. Come inside. She followed him up the path and up the porch steps, and as she passed the two children, she tried a small smile. The little girl, who she would learn was named Pearl, and who was 7 years old, and who had not spoken more than a handful of words to anyone outside the family in the 2 years since her mother died, looked at Eliza with those enormous dark eyes, and then looked away. The boy stared at her with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself once, back when she was 13 and her father brought home a woman named Hattie, who smelled like rosewater and smiled too much and lasted 8 months before she was gone. The boy's expression said, I know what you are. You're a replacement, and I won't let you. She filed that away. Inside, the house was dim and clean in the way of a place that is swept but not loved, where someone does the necessary things without any of the extra ones. The furniture was solid and plain. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall. The kitchen was through an open doorway. A large iron stove, a table with 4 chairs, shelves holding jars and tins arranged without any particular care. Everything functional. Nothing decorative. No flowers anywhere, dried or otherwise. No curtains on the kitchen window, just bare glass. Gideon set her bag near the foot of the stairs. Your room is up here, he said. Second door on the right. It's small. That's fine. He turned and looked at her again with that careful, shuddered look. Pearl sleeps across the hall from you. Caleb's at the end. All right. I sleep in the loft above the barn. She absorbed that. All right, she said again. The letters, he said, were an arrangement. I want to be clear about that. This is a practical matter. The ranch needs managing. The children need tending. I need someone who can handle both. I understand. Do you? It wasn't quite a question either. She looked at him steadily. You wrote to me clearly, Mr. Hale. You told me what you needed and what you were offering. I wrote back the same way. I didn't come out here chasing something romantic. I came because I needed a place and you needed help. Something moved behind his eyes. She couldn't name it, and then was gone. Good, he said. Supper's at 6. I'll show you the rest of the ranch tomorrow. He went back out the front door, and she heard his boots on the porch steps, and then the quiet returned, and she stood in the middle of the dim front room with her bag at her feet, and the sound of her own breathing and the distant noise of chickens in the yard. That's Papa's chair, said a small voice. She turned. Pearl was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, one hand on the doorframe, looking at a worn armchair near the fireplace that Eliza had not moved toward or touched. I can see that, Eliza said. Thank you for telling me. Pearl considered her for a moment. Then she retreated back into the kitchen without another word. The room upstairs was indeed small. It had a narrow iron bed, a single window that looked out over the side yard, and the begin of the slope running down toward the creek, a wooden chair, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. Someone had put a folded blanket on the bed. Recently, she thought, because there was no dust on it. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window for a while. She was not a woman given to self-pity. Her mother had died when she was 9, and she'd learned from that early that crying about the shape of your life didn't change it, only made your face hurt. Her father had been a decent man in the way that weak men sometimes manage to be. Not mean, not cruel, just absent in all the ways that mattered, slipping further into drink and distance until she was 16 and doing most of the household surviving on her own. When he'd died 2 years later of something wrong with his heart, she'd felt grief, yes, but also a terrible guilty relief, because it meant she could finally stop waiting for things to get better and start deciding what better actually looked like. What it had looked like, in the end, was this. The advertisement in the Colton Wells Courier. Widower with 2 children seeks capable woman for partnership and ranch management in the Harlan Valley. Partnership. She'd liked that word. It suggested something equal, or at least something possible. She unpacked her bag, hung her 2 dresses on the hook, set her comb and soap and small mirror on the windowsill, put her Bible on the chair because there was nowhere else to put it. put the bundle of letters in the very bottom of the bag, and left them there. Then she went downstairs to learn the kitchen. Caleb Hale's name, she learned through Pearl and context, and the general way of things, meant something like stubborn and certain of himself, though she doubted anyone had planned it that way. He was 13. He had his father's dark coloring and, apparently, his father's talent for silence used as a weapon. He came into the kitchen at 5:30 while she was trying to figure out the stove's particular personality. Every wood-burning stove had one. You had to learn which way it ran hot, where the cold spots were, whether it liked the damper open 2 inches or 3. And he stood in the doorway and watched her with his arms crossed. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. She didn't look up. "Not yet. I will." Mama knew exactly how to work that stove. I expect she did. She had longer to learn it than I've had. That's not what I mean. She did look up then. He was staring at her with something that was trying to be contempt but wasn't quite making it. There was too much pain underneath it for contempt to get a clean foothold. She knew that look too, in a different way. "Caleb," she said carefully, "I'm not here to pretend anything. I know this is hard. I know having a stranger in your house is hard, especially now. I'm not going to tell you it isn't." "You don't know anything about now," he said. "You don't know anything about this family." "No," she agreed. "Not yet." He pushed off the doorframe and walked through the kitchen without looking at her again, out the back door, and she heard his boots crossing the yard in the direction of the barn. She turned back to the stove. 2 inches on the damper, she decided. It ran a little cool on the left side. Supper that first evening was a quiet, tense affair that Eliza navigated the way she imagined you'd navigate a field you suspected might have hidden roots. Carefully, watching where you put your feet, trying not to trip anything. She'd made a simple meal, salt pork and beans that she'd found in the pantry, cornbread from a recipe she'd memorized so long ago. It lived in her hands more than her head, dried apple slices from the last of what was in the cellar crock. Nothing special, but solid, hot, the kind of food that told a cold body it was going to be all right for another night. Gideon sat at the head of the table. Caleb sat to his left with his eyes on his plate. Pearl sat across from Caleb, her hands folded in her lap with the careful formality of a child who has learned that small ceremonies can be held on to when everything else is uncertain. They ate. After a few minutes, Pearl reached across the table for the cornbread, and her sleeve knocked over her cup of water. It spread across the table in a fast, flat wave, and Pearl made a small, stricken sound and looked immediately at her father. Gideon was already on his feet, grabbing a rag from the shelf beside the stove. He moved quickly, efficiently, mopped up the water, set the cup back. "It's all right," he said to Pearl, and his voice was different when he spoke to her. Still quiet, but the shuttered quality went out of it. "It's just water." Pearl nodded, but her eyes were bright, and she held herself very still the way children do when they're trying not to cry in front of people. "The cornbread is better now anyway," Eliza said. "Water makes everything taste better. That's a scientific fact." Pearl looked at her. Gideon looked at her. Caleb looked at her. "That's not a scientific fact," Caleb said. "It might be," Eliza said. "I haven't checked all of them." Pearl almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Caleb looked back at his plate. Gideon said nothing, but she felt him watching her for a moment before he went back to eating. The ranch tour came the next morning, early, with frost still on the grass and their breath coming out in small clouds. Gideon walked her through everything with the efficiency of a man who knows his time is valuable and has learned not to waste it. The barn, the outbuildings, the chicken yard, the kitchen garden that had been let go to seed and would need to be put to rights before the hard freeze came. He showed her the root cellar, which was better stocked than she'd feared, and the smokehouse, which held what remained of last autumn's work. He showed her the well and explained its depth and temperament. He showed her the creek at the bottom of the meadow and told her where it flooded in spring and where it stayed reliable. He told her these things in the flat, factual voice of someone giving information, not having a conversation. She listened carefully and asked only practical questions and did not try to fill the silences with unnecessary noise. They were coming back up the slope from the creek when she noticed the far corner of the north pasture fence. 3 rails down, the post rotted clean through at the ground. "That fence," she said. "I know." "How long has it been down?" A pause. "Since late summer." She looked at him. He was looking at the fence, not at her, and his jaw was set in the way of a man who is aware of a failure and doesn't particularly want to discuss it. She'd read the signs of this place by now. The peeling paint, the rails in the yard that needed stacking, the kitchen garden gone to ruin. These were not the signs of a man who was lazy. The barn was tight and clean, the animals well kept, the machinery in reasonable order. These were the signs of a man who had been managing survival for a long time with insufficient help, making decisions daily about what mattered most, and letting the rest slide. And the rest had been sliding for probably 2 years now, since before his wife died, while she was sick and he was running the ranch alone and watching her fade. She didn't say any of that. She just said, "I can fix a fence." He looked at her then. That assessing look again, but something had shifted slightly in it. "Caleb can show you where the posts are stored," he said, and kept walking. Whoop. She fixed the fence that afternoon alone, because Caleb looked at her request for help the way you'd look at someone asking you to voluntarily participate in your own embarrassment and went to do something else. She found the posts herself in the back of the equipment shed. New cedar, which Gideon had apparently bought and simply not gotten around to using, and she dragged them to the north pasture by hand, 2 at a time, because there was no one to help her harness the draft horse to the cart, and she wasn't yet sure of the horse's temperament. It took her most of the afternoon. Her shoulders ached and her hands would have blisters by morning, and she lost the head of the post driver into the grass twice and had to go hunting for it, swearing quietly under her breath in a manner her father would not have approved of. The work was hard and stupid and repetitive, and she loved it in the way she loved all hard, honest work. For the way it emptied her head out, for the way it was clear and measurable, for the way at the end you could look at something and say, "That was not done before, and now it is." She was driving the last post when she became aware that someone was watching her. She turned. Gideon stood at the edge of the pasture, maybe 30 yards away. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He had his hat in his hand and he was looking at the line of new posts and rails she'd strung, and then he looked at her. She straightened up and waited. He put his hat back on and walked away. She didn't know what to make of it. She went back to the house, heated water, washed the dirt off her hands, and made supper. Voisin. Mirabelle Hatch came from the neighboring farm 3 days later, riding a stout gray horse and carrying a covered dish, and the kind of bright, determinedly charitable expression that Eliza had learned to be wary of. Mirabelle Hatch was perhaps 50, broad-faced and vigorous, with the standing in the community that comes from having been there longest and knowing everyone's business well enough to have formed opinions about all of it. She was not unkind, she was just comprehensive. "Well," Mirabelle said, setting her dish on the kitchen table and looking at Eliza with the frank assessment of a woman who feels she has earned the right to look at people however she likes. "You're younger than I expected." "Everyone keeps saying that," Eliza said, and Mirabelle laughed, a short, surprised sound, and some of the performance went out of her. "I brought a potato soup," Mirabelle said. "It's the least I could do. We were all sorry when Mrs. Hale passed. She was a good woman. This was a good house when she was running it." Eliza heard what was underneath that plainly enough. She smiled. "It's a good house now. It just needs some catching up." Mirabelle looked around the kitchen with an expression that tried to be neutral and didn't quite get there. "Yes. Well, Gideon's had a hard time of it. We all tried to help, but—" She paused delicately. "He doesn't easily accept help." "No," Eliza agreed. "I don't imagine he does. And you? Are you settling in all right?" "Getting there." "The children?" "Pearl is sweet. Caleb is—" She paused, chose honestly over diplomacy. "Caleb is working through something. That's understandable." Mirabelle studied her for a moment. "You know," she said, "the Valley expected Gideon to— well, we thought he'd bring in family. His mother, or his sister from Durango. Not a—" She stopped. "Not a stranger from a newspaper advertisement," Eliza finished. Mirabelle had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "People will talk, is what I mean. They already are. I just want you to know that." "I appreciate the warning," Eliza said pleasantly. "Would you like tea?" Mirabelle stayed 2 hours. By the end of it, she was helping Eliza reshelve the pantry and telling her which families in the valley were worth knowing and which ones would steal your fence rails if you left them unattended. Eliza filed it all away. After Mirabelle left, Eliza stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked out at the yard. The valley was going amber in the late afternoon light. Somewhere on the property, she could hear hammering, Gideon, working on something she hadn't identified yet, the steady rhythm of a man who doesn't stop moving because stopping means thinking. She turned back to the stove. The first real test came at the end of her first week. She'd woken early, earlier than usual, something pulling her out of sleep before the light came, and gone downstairs to find Gideon already at the table with his coffee and the ranch's account book open in front of him. He looked up when she came in. She could see from the lines around his eyes and the way he was sitting, too straight, too stiff, that he hadn't slept well. She put water on for her own coffee and sat down across from him without asking. He didn't tell her to leave. The account book was open to the current page. She could see the numbers from where she sat, and they were not good numbers. She knew ranch accounting well enough. Her father had kept books, poorly, and she'd sometimes tried to make sense of them, to understand the shape of what she was looking at. A cold winter coming, supplies that needed buying, and not enough margin to buy them without cutting somewhere that would hurt. The Kellerman brothers have been cutting into your grazing land on the eastern slope, she said. He looked up sharply. I saw it yesterday when I was checking the creek fence. Their cattle were on your grass, maybe 200 yards past the boundary marker. I don't know if it's recent or if it's been going on. A silence. How long were you over there? Long enough to count their animals and mark the spot. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man recalculating something. You know cattle. My uncle ran a small herd. I helped him summers. Another silence. He closed the account book. The Kellermans have been pushing at that boundary since last spring, he said. I haven't had time to push back. Would it help if I rode out and talked to them? No. Flat and certain. All right. I'll deal with it. I know you will. He looked at her. You don't need to manage me. She met his gaze steadily. I'm not managing you. I'm offering to help. There's a difference. He seemed to sit with that for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the gray morning. The fence on the eastern slope needs attention anyway, he said finally. I'll ride out tomorrow. I'll go with you. He glanced at her. I know where the spot is, she said. It'll be faster. A longer pause. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. She got up to tend her coffee, and she kept her face carefully neutral, and she did not let herself feel too much about the small, quiet fact that they had just, without exactly meaning to, had something that resembled an actual conversation. Pearl spoke to her again on the 9th day. Eliza had been in the kitchen garden trying to salvage what could still be salvaged before the freeze. Turnips, mostly, and some late-season kale that was hanging on stubbornly, and a row of carrots she hadn't expected to find at all. She was on her knees in the dirt with mud on her hands when she heard small footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around or make a fuss. She just kept pulling carrots. Mama used to put sage in the window boxes, Pearl said, so it would smell nice when the window was open. That's a good idea, Eliza said. Did she grow it herself or buy it? A pause. She grew it. In that corner. A small finger pointed toward the overgrown eastern corner of the garden, where something Eliza had assumed was just a patch of weeds, was, she now saw, the last straggling remnant of a proper herb bed. Can you show me? Eliza asked. Pearl came forward slowly, like a cat deciding whether a thing is safe, and crouched beside the herb bed and began pointing things out in a small, careful voice. There had been sage, yes, and thyme, and something she called the lemon plant, which turned out to be lemon balm, all of it scraggly and half dead, but not entirely past saving. They spent an hour in the garden together, Eliza pulling weeds and Pearl naming things. Pearl did not smile. She did not warm up in any obvious way. But she stayed, and she kept talking in that small, careful voice, and Eliza counted it carefully, because she understood that with some people the distance comes down one brick at a time, and you have to be patient with the pace of it. When they went inside for supper, Pearl sat across from her at the table the way she always did, but she sat, Eliza thought, perhaps an inch or two closer to her usual chair. She didn't mention it. Well, Caleb, meanwhile, was consistent in his resistance. He was not cruel. She gave him that. He didn't try to sabotage her or antagonize her with any real malice. He was simply thoroughly, completely, uninterested in her existence, in the way that teenagers sometimes manage to indicate that someone is beneath their notice without technically doing anything wrong. He did his chores. He answered direct questions with direct answers that were as short as he could make them. He ate supper, and then vanished in the direction of the barn, and came back after dark. She watched him when she could do it without him noticing, and she tried to read him the way she'd learned to read the ranch, for what was actually wrong, not just what looked broken on the surface. What she saw was this. He worked hard. He knew the ranch better than anyone, rode better than his father. She suspected. had the instincts of someone who'd been learning this land since he could walk. He cared about the animals with a devotion that he showed to almost nothing else. She'd seen him spend 40 minutes with a heifer who'd cut her leg on the wire, patient and careful and absolutely unhurried, his hands gentle in a way that his face never was. He'd been 13 when his mother got sick. 12, maybe, when things started going badly. He'd spent a year or more watching his father run ragged, trying to keep the ranch going while also watching Ruth Hale die by degrees. And Caleb, old enough to understand, too young to do enough, had been keeping this family together in all the invisible ways that kids in that position do, without being asked and without being thanked, because everyone is too exhausted to notice. She understood that too, in a different way. She didn't push. She just stayed consistent, did what she said she'd do, didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't, didn't try to insert herself where she wasn't wanted. She left him alone in the way that was respectful, not the way that was defeat. 3 weeks in, she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard Gideon's voice from the other side of the yard, not speaking to her, speaking to someone else, and the something in his voice made her go still. Already told you, the answer is no. She recognized the other voice after a moment. Frank Kellerman, the older of the two Kellerman brothers. She'd seen him once from a distance at the general store in Harlan when she'd gone in with Gideon for supplies. A big slab of a man with a handsome face and the kind of ease that comes from having always been the largest person in the room. Gideon. Kellerman's voice had a pleasant, reasonable tone that Eliza distrusted immediately. I'm not trying to start anything. I'm making you a fair offer. Your offer's not fair and you know it. Given what you're carrying right now, it might be the best you're going to see. A silence. Eliza stood very still with a wet shirt in her hands. You want to ride out and look at the eastern boundary while you're here? Gideon said. Since we seem to be on the subject of what's mine. A pause on Kellerman's end. Less certain now. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Another pause. I heard you brought in a woman to help manage things. That's right. People are talking about that. People can talk about whatever they like. Gideon's voice was completely flat, the way of a man who has run out of patience but is containing himself carefully. My answer is no, Frank. It'll be no next time you ask too. I'd appreciate you not coming back to ask it. She heard footsteps, then the sound of a horse moving away. She stayed still until the sounds faded, then went back to hanging the laundry. That evening at supper, Gideon looked at her across the table and said, Kellerman wants to buy the eastern pasture. I know, she said. He looked at her. I was hanging laundry, she said simply. He nodded once. He's made the offer 3 times in the last year. He thinks I'll break. Will you? Something shifted in his face. Hard and certain. No. Good, she said, and passed the cornbread, and they ate. It was during the 4th week that she understood something important about this place, and about herself in it. She had ridden out to check the stock in the northern pasture. Gideon had given her this task with the economy of a man delegating not because he trusted her entirely, but because the ranch needed more pairs of hands than he had, and the math was simple. She'd taken the bay mare, Dolly, who was older and sensible, and who had decided after some initial skepticism that Eliza was probably acceptable. The morning was cold and bright, the frost burned off early, and the hills above were dark against a sky that was almost painfully blue. She was counting the cattle when she became aware that something was wrong. One of the young heifers, a brown and white one she'd noticed before because she had a habit of getting her head through the fence, was standing apart from the others at the edge of the tree line, and even from a distance Eliza could see by the set of her haunches and the tension in her neck that something was wrong. She rode over and dismounted. The heifer had gotten into something, wild choke cherry, she thought, or possibly some kind of fungi near the tree roots, and she was in distress, head low, breathing too fast, her eyes showing white. Eliza did a fast assessment, her hands moving over the animal's sides and belly, and thought she was going to be all right, probably, but not without help, and not without getting back to the barn. She got the heifer moving. It took patience and some creative persuasion, and she led her slowly back across the pasture with Dolly following loose-reined like a patient friend. And it took the better part of 2 hours because the heifer wanted to stop, and Eliza couldn't let her stop. She was halfway across the home meadow when she saw Caleb coming from the direction of the barn. He saw her and changed course. He came across the grass at a jog and arrived slightly out of breath and looked at the heifer with quick, assessing eyes. What happened? Something she ate, I think. She's been in distress for about 2 hours. I kept her moving. I was already putting his hands on the heifer, moving with that same careful efficiency she'd seen with the cut leg. He checked her eyes, her breathing, pressed along her belly. She'll need the charcoal draft, he said, and she needs to stay moving another hour, at least. He stopped, looked at Eliza. You already know that. I do, she agreed. A silence that was different from their usual silences. Shorter, more uncertain, like he wasn't sure what to do with a situation that hadn't gone the way he'd expected it to. I'll get the draft, he said finally, and went toward the barn at a jog. She kept walking the heifer. Caleb came back with the charcoal draft mixed in a small bucket, and they gave it to the heifer together. And then they walked her in slow circles in the yard for an hour and a half without saying much of anything. But they did it together, and they were easy with each other in the way of two people who both know what they're doing and don't need to perform it. When the heifer was stable enough to be put in the near paddock with good grass and water, Caleb stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the ground for a moment. Then he said, You turned her in time. She's a good heifer, Eliza said. She wanted to get better. He nodded at the ground. Then he looked up, not quite at her, more at the fence post beside her. I saw you fix the north pasture fence, he said. First week. I was watching from the loft. She waited. You set the posts right, he said. Most people don't. They go too shallow. My uncle taught me, she said. He nodded. That was all. He put his hands back in his pockets and went to the barn. And she stood in the yard with the quiet around her and thought that sometimes the way people begin to let you in is so small and so sideways that you almost miss it. And the important thing was not to make too much of it when you didn't miss it. The night she finally cried was a Thursday, deep in her 5th week, after Pearl had gotten a fever that had scared them all badly for about 6 hours before breaking cleanly, and after she'd spent most of those 6 hours sitting beside Pearl's bed, with cold cloths and quiet company, while Gideon paced the hall outside like a man who would have taken the fever himself if anyone had given him that option. When Pearl finally slept, easy and cool, Gideon had stood in the doorway looking at his daughter for a long moment, and then looked at Eliza, who was gathering the cloths in the basin. Thank you, he said. His voice was different, not shut, just present. She nodded and slipped past him into the hall. She went downstairs and outside, into the dark yard, and she sat on the cold porch steps and let herself cry for about 10 minutes. Not loudly, not theatrically, just the quiet, private kind that is really about exhaustion more than anything else. The leaking off of weeks of effort and tension and not knowing if she was doing anything right. Then she wiped her face and went back inside and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table alone in the lamplight. The house was quiet around her, quiet and solid. The stove ticked with heat. She thought about the things she'd expected from this place and the things she'd found instead, and how they were almost entirely different, and how the things she'd found were, she searched for the word, real. Not comfortable, not easy, not anything she'd imagined. Just real. The kind of real that has weight and texture and doesn't let you slide past it. She thought about Caleb saying you set the posts right. She thought about Pearl in the herb garden, saying the lemon plant. She thought about Gideon, that morning, standing at the fence she'd repaired, with his hat in his hand. She wasn't in this house yet. She was still something between a stranger and a resident, still finding the edges of things, still building trust one small, careful transaction at a time. But she was here, and Black Hollow Ranch, cold and complicated and broken in places, with its peeling paint and its grieving man and its angry boy and its quiet little girl. Black Hollow Ranch was starting to feel, just barely, just around the edges, like something she might fight for. Not because she'd been promised it, not because it was easy or comfortable or anything like what she'd imagined, but because the hard things were the ones worth fighting for. She'd known that since she was 9 years old and learned that the world didn't rearrange itself for your grief. It just waited for you to decide what to do next. She drank her tea. Outside, the wind moved across the valley, cold and clean, carrying the smell of coming winter. She thought, I'm still here. And she thought, that counts for something. She put her cup in the basin and went to bed, and she slept better than she had since the day she arrived. Winter came to Black Hollow the way it always did in the Harlan Valley. Not gradually, not with any particular warning, but all at once, like a decision that had been made somewhere up in the mountains and simply announced itself one morning as fact. Eliza woke on a Tuesday in late November to find the world outside her window, white and still, the meadow buried under 8 inches of snow that had fallen silently in the night, and the temperature dropped so hard and fast that the water in the basin on her windowsill had a thin skin of ice across the top. She broke the ice with 2 fingers, washed her face in the cold water without complaining about it because complaining required an audience and she was alone, and went downstairs to get the stove going before anyone else was up. This had become her habit, her small, private claim on the morning, the one part of the day that was entirely hers before it became everyone else's. She'd learned the kitchen stove's temperament by now, the way you learn a difficult personality, its preferences, its moods, the particular combination of kindling and timing that got it cooperative rather than contrary. She had it going in 4 minutes and had the coffee on in 6, and she stood at the kitchen window in the blue pre-dawn light and watched the snow in the yard and thought about what needed doing. The list was never short. It had never been short since the day she arrived, and if anything, it had grown in the weeks since, because the more she understood the ranch, the more she could see the places where things had slipped. A working ranch in November was a particular kind of relentless. The animals didn't stop kneading because the temperature dropped. The fences didn't stop kneading because the snow came. And the firewood situation, she'd realized with a cold clarity 2 weeks ago, was not as good as it ought to be. They had enough to get through December, probably. After that, it depended on how bad the winter ran. She added that to the list. Gideon came in from the barn at 7, snow on his shoulders and his face red from the cold, and he stood at the stove and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she handed him without a word, and they stood in the kitchen together in the early light for a few minutes before the day fully arrived. These moments had become not comfortable exactly, but less uncomfortable. The sharp edge of strangeness had worn down some. They were still largely careful with each other, still moving in the polite, measured way of two people sharing space without having fully decided what kind of space it was. But the silences between them had changed character. They were less like walls now and more like pauses, the kind you could breathe in. "There's ice on the creek bend," he said after a while. "I saw it yesterday. The south end is still open." He nodded. "I'll need to check the north pasture water troughs. They'll have frozen overnight. I'll do the chickens in the south section. If you want, I can start on that woodpile situation after." He glanced at her. "What woodpile situation?" "We're short for a hard winter," she said simply. "We've got December, maybe. If January runs cold, we'll feel it." A pause. She could see him running the numbers in his head, checking them against his own assessment, finding that they matched. "I've been meaning to get out to the tanner stand," he said. "There's a section of dead timber on the eastern edge that's been down since summer. Should have been cut by now." He said it without particular self-criticism, just as a fact, the way men who are managing more than they can handle sometimes speak about the things they haven't gotten to, not excusing it, just acknowledging it as part of the arithmetic. "I can handle an axe," she said. He gave her a look that was somewhere between skeptical and something she couldn't name. "I'm not saying I can do it alone," she said. "I'm saying I can help. We could get Caleb out there, too. Make it go faster." Another pause. Then he said, "Saturday, if the weather holds." She nodded and poured herself coffee, and the morning moved on. The woodpile conversation was, in the larger scheme of things, small. But there was something in those small conversations that had been building since the beginning, something she didn't want to look at too directly, because she'd found that some things fall apart if you examine them too hard. What she could say, simply, was that she was becoming useful in ways she hadn't fully expected, not just in the kitchen and the garden and the mending, but in the thinking and the planning of things, in the sitting down together and figuring it out way that was, she suspected, what Gideon had needed even more than extra hands, and had perhaps not known how to ask for. She did not allow herself to call it anything more than that. He was a private man carrying a grief she couldn't see the bottom of, and she had her own purposes here that had nothing to do with sentiment. She was practical. She stayed practical. She went out to see to the chickens and tried not to think about the way the kitchen had felt just then, with the two of them in it and the snow outside and the coffee warm in her hands. She was mostly successful. The woodcutting on Saturday went the way. Most things went at Black Hollow, harder than planned, less clean than hoped, and ultimately done through a combination of stubbornness and the unwillingness of any of them to be the first to say they were finished. They drove out to the tanner stand on the wagon, Gideon and Eliza on the bench, and Caleb in the back with the axes and the saw, and a look of studied indifference that she'd decided was just his face when he didn't know how to feel about something. The dead timber was where Gideon had said it would be. A good section of downed spruce and pine that had fallen in a summer storm and dried out nicely over the months since, which was the one silver lining of not having gotten to it sooner. They worked for 5 hours. It was cold in the way of working cold, which is different from standing still cold. The exertion kept the worst of it off, and by mid-morning Eliza had her coat open and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the bite of the axe coming down had its own satisfying rhythm. She was not elegant with it. Her form was functional rather than practiced, and by the 3rd hour her right shoulder was arguing with her, and she had to switch to leading more with her left, which her left did not particularly appreciate. But she kept going because stopping for a reason other than genuine necessity was not something she was inclined to do. At one point she looked up and found Caleb watching her. Not with the old calculating suspicion, just watching, the way you watch something that has surprised you, and you're still deciding what to do with that. "Your grip's wrong," he said. She looked at her hands on the axe handle. "How so?" He came over and showed her, adjusting where her hand sat and the angle she was pulling through. He didn't say anything extra about it, just demonstrated briefly, and stepped back. His hands were his father's hands, she noticed, wide across the knuckles, already roughened by years of work. "Better," he said, watching her swing again. "Better," she agreed. That was the whole of it. But for the rest of the afternoon he worked within reasonable distance of her instead of pointedly at the other end of the stand, and she counted that the way she'd learned to count things at Black Hollow. Carefully, quietly, without making a production of it. Gideon said nothing about any of it. He worked steadily and without complaint, splitting logs with the kind of economy that comes from having done something thousands of times. And she noticed his left leg bothering him by mid-afternoon. A subtle thing, the way he shifted his weight, the way he took a few extra seconds before certain swings. She didn't mention it. He wouldn't have wanted her to. They loaded the wagon and drove home in the early dark, the horses blowing steam, the load solid and good behind them, and nobody said much, but the silence had a different quality than it had on the way out. More like a shared thing than a separate one. The talk in the valley had been building since her first week, and by December it had reached a kind of steady hum that she could feel even without hearing the specific words. She knew the shape of it because Mirabelle Hatch, who had become something between a cautious ally and an unreliable reporter, kept her informed, not out of cruelty, but out of the peculiar brand of helpfulness that some people express by making sure you know all the worst things people are saying about you. "Clara Voss says you've got no right to that house," Mirabelle told her one afternoon, arriving with another covered dish, and the kind of expression that wanted to appear neutral and never quite got there. "She says Gideon was in no state to make a sensible agreement and somebody should have talked him out of it." "And what do you say?" Eliza asked. "I say Clara Voss hasn't done a useful thing since 1887, and her opinion isn't worth the air it takes to deliver it." Mirabelle paused. "But she's not the only one talking. The Harlan settlement expects—" People had certain expectations about how Gideon would manage things after Ruth. What kind of expectations? That he'd bring in family, or, well, someone people knew. Someone with a history in the valley. Mirabelle looked at her directly. "You came out of nowhere is what I mean. You're young, and you're a stranger, and nobody knows your people." "My people are gone," Eliza said. "That's rather the point." Mirabelle absorbed that. "I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying it's what you're dealing with." Eliza knew what she was dealing with. She'd known it from the first week, from the way Frank Kellerman had used the phrase "I heard you brought in a woman with that particular flat intonation that made it sound like bringing in livestock." She was being watched and assessed by people who had already decided on their conclusion and were simply waiting for the evidence to arrange itself accordingly. They expected her to fail, to leave, to reveal herself as some kind of opportunist who'd latched onto a grieving man's practicality and would eventually extract what she could from it and go. She went to the Harlan settlement store on a Tuesday in December for the ranch's supply run, alone, because Gideon had the farrier out and couldn't leave. It was the first time she'd been into town by herself, and she felt the weight of it. The eyes that tracked her from the moment she climbed down from the wagon, the conversations that went slightly quieter as she passed, the particular quality of small settlement attention that is less about hostility than about appetite. People in isolated places are hungry for narrative. She was a story, and they were reading her. She went through her list methodically. Flour, salt, lamp oil, 2 new axe handles because the old ones were cracking, a spool of wire for the south pasture fence, and a small bottle of liniment she'd noticed was getting low in the barn medicine box and didn't imagine Gideon had thought to replace. She did all of it without particular trouble, and she was polite and direct and didn't offer explanations she hadn't been asked for. She was loading the wagon when Henry Dodd, who ran the Harlan settlement post and seemed to have opinions about everything that passed through it, appeared at her elbow. "You're the Hale woman," he said, as though he was confirming something to himself. "I'm Eliza Mercer," she said, without looking up from the crate. "I work at Black Hollow Ranch." Funny way to put it. She looked at him then. He was a small man, wiry, with the fussy self-importance of someone who has made himself indispensable to other people's information and knows it. His eyes were sharp and not particularly kind. "Mr. Dodd," she said pleasantly, "is there something I can help you with?" "Just making conversation." "Then I hope the rest of your conversations today are interesting." She picked up the crate. "Excuse me." She heard him make a sound behind her that might have been a laugh or might have been something else, and she kept walking and loaded the crate and climbed onto the wagon and drove back to Black Hollow without once letting her hands shake on the reins, which was something she was mildly proud of. She told Gideon about it that evening, not because she needed to, but because he had a right to know the character of what was being said in the settlement about his ranch. She told him plainly, without drama. He listened with his face in that closed, still configuration, and when she finished, he said, "Dodd's been managing other people's business since before I came to this valley. He's not worth losing sleep over." "I'm not losing sleep over him," she said. "Good." A pause. He looked at the table, then back at her. "You should know," he said carefully, "that there are men in this valley, Kellerman, some others, who will use anything they can find. The talk going around isn't entirely innocent. It's also strategy." She looked at him. "Strategy for what?" "Making the ranch look unstable, unmanaged." He paused again, measuring his words with the care of a man who doesn't say things until he's decided they're worth saying. "If enough people believe I can't hold this place together, the land becomes available in a different way. The offers come differently." She sat with that for a moment. "The eastern pasture, and more. The Kellermans want the creek access. 2 other families have been watching the northern grazing land since Ruth died." He looked out the window at the dark. "They've been patient. They're still being patient. But they're counting on things falling apart." Yes. She thought about the way Henry Dodd had said the Hale woman, and the way Clara Voss was apparently keeping a running commentary on the legitimacy of her presence here. And she understood that the gossip and the land pressure were not separate things. They were the same thing wearing different clothes. Undermine the woman, undermine the man, and the ranch becomes something easier to pick apart. "Then we don't fall apart," she said. Gideon looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. It had something in it she hadn't seen there before, or hadn't seen clearly. Something that was neither assessment nor dismissal. "No," he said quietly. "We don't." Though we sat in the room between them for a moment, and neither of them addressed it, and then supper was ready, and Caleb came in from the barn, and Pearl appeared at the kitchen door, and the ordinary business of the evening moved forward and covered it over the way water covers a stone. But it was there. December moved towards Christmas with the particular gray persistence of high country winter, and Eliza moved through it the same way, persistent, gray-free on the outside, even when she was tired, which she was, often. Ranch work in winter was not dramatically different from ranch work in fall, except that everything took longer, everything was colder, and the margin for error was smaller, because a small mistake in cold weather could become a large problem faster than you could correct it. She developed a rhythm with the days. Up before light, stove going, water on. Out to the south section, the chickens, checking on the animals she'd taken particular responsibility for, which now included most of the smaller livestock and a range of incidental duties that had accumulated over the weeks, the way duties do. Nobody assigns them. You just find yourself doing them, and then they're yours. Back in for the mid-morning work, which might be kitchen and preservation and the constant interior maintenance that a house this size required, or might be outdoor work if something needed attention. Midday meal, which was usually simple. Afternoon work. Supper, which she took seriously because it was the one point in the day when all 4 of them were in the same room, and the act of eating together carried a weight she felt even when no one was talking. After supper, mending, account books which Gideon had begun allowing her to review and occasionally update, and if she had the energy, the brief quiet hour before bed that was entirely her own. Pearl had begun, in the slow, sideways way of Pearl, to spend time in Eliza's company in the evenings. Not talking much, that wasn't Pearl's way, but sitting nearby, drawing in a small notebook she carried everywhere, or sorting through the buttons in the button box that lived on the shelf by the window, a task that apparently never got old. Sometimes she'd bring the notebook and show Eliza what she'd drawn without comment, as an offer of something, and Eliza would look at it seriously and say what she actually thought rather than performing enthusiasm, and Pearl seemed to appreciate the difference. One evening Pearl showed her a drawing that stopped her. A woman at a stove, seen from behind, her hair pinned up, her posture bent slightly forward in the attitude of someone stirring something. The drawing was simple, the lines a child's lines, but there was something in the set of the woman's shoulders that was unmistakably. She looked at Pearl. Pearl was looking at the button box. "That's very good," Eliza said quietly. "I draw Mama sometimes," Pearl said, still looking at the buttons, "so I don't forget." Eliza looked at the drawing again. "That's a good idea," she said. "A really good idea." "Caleb says I shouldn't. He says it makes Papa sad." "Does it make you sad?" Pearl thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "Sometimes," she said, "but sometimes it makes me feel like she's still here a little bit." Eliza looked at the drawing one more time and handed it back. "I think you should keep drawing," she said. "And I think if Caleb says anything else about it, you can tell him I said so." Pearl put the drawing carefully back in her notebook and went back to the buttons, and the evening continued, and Eliza sat with the particular ache of knowing she was walking in the shadow of a woman she'd never meet, and doing her best not to trip. The fight between her and Caleb, when it finally came, happened on a Thursday afternoon in the week before Christmas. It had been building for a while. She could feel the pressure of it, the way you feel a storm coming before the clouds arrive. A change in the atmosphere, the animals getting edgy. Caleb had been working too hard and sleeping too little, which was an observation she'd made and kept to herself. And he'd been more clipped than usual, more locked down, which with Caleb meant something closer to the surface than he was willing to show. She'd been in the root cellar doing an inventory, cross-referencing what was down there against what they'd likely need for the rest of the winter and mapping out where they'd need to be careful. When Caleb came down the cellar steps and stood in the low light looking at her with an expression that had too many things in it. "I need to know something," he said. She set down her pencil and looked at him. "All right. Why are you actually here?" She kept her voice even. "You know why. I know what you told my father. That's not the same thing." He crossed his arms, a gesture that in him always meant something he was trying to contain. "A girl your age, no family, comes to a strange man's ranch out of a newspaper notice. What kind of sense does that make?" "The kind where your options are limited and you make the best choice available," she said simply. "Or the kind where you're looking for something to take." The air in the cellar went still and cold, and it wasn't just the temperature. "Caleb," she said carefully, "we had nothing when my mother was dying," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he clearly hated that it did. "My father sold the south pasture equipment just to keep us going, and now there's money coming in again, the ranch is running better, and you're—" He stopped. Started again. "You're 18 years old, you came here with nothing, and now you're in our house, in our kitchen, and Pearl talks to you like—" Another stop. His jaw was tight and working. "Like what?" she said. "Not hard, not soft, just waiting, like you're her mother." He said it like an accusation, but underneath it she could hear the thing it actually was. A wound that had been opened and hadn't healed and kept getting touched. "You're not her mother, you'll never be her mother, and it's not fair to let her think, to let her get—" He ran out of words, or possibly just ran out of the ability to keep his voice steady, which in a 13-year-old boy who has been carrying a man's weight for 2 years is not weakness. It's simple physics. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the easy thing to say, the reassuring thing, the things designed to diffuse the moment and make it smaller and more manageable. She decided against them. "You're right," she said. He blinked. That wasn't what he'd expected. "I'm not your mother. I'm not trying to be. I'm not going to pretend I can be that, and I won't." She looked at him steadily. "But Caleb, I want you to hear this, and I need you to actually hear it and not argue with it until I'm done. Can you do that?" He said nothing, which she took as sufficient. I came here because I needed somewhere to go. That's the truth. I was honest with your father about it. I don't have people. I don't have land. I don't have options that were clearly better than this one. She paused. I'm not going to pretend this was all about courage and selflessness, because that would be a lie, and I won't lie to you. I came here for practical reasons. He was listening. His arms had uncrossed slightly, barely, but enough. But I've been here 6 weeks now, she said, and something changed in that 6 weeks. And it's not about money or land or anything you're worried about. It's that this place matters to me now. Your sister matters to me. Not as a replacement, not as something to manage, as a person. She paused again. And whether you believe that or not is your choice to make. I can't make it for you. He looked at the floor of the cellar. The lantern light was uneven, throwing sharp shadows. She draws her mother, he said finally. Quieter now. In that notebook. I know. Does it... He stopped. Does she seem... She seems like a girl who loves her mother very much and is doing the best she can, Eliza said. Same as the rest of you. The silence stretched. He shifted his weight, looked at the shelves, looked at his own hands. She burned 2 batches of cornbread her first week, he said, and it took her a moment to realize he was talking about his mother, about Ruth, and she kept very still and let him. She never did figure out that stove. She used to swear at it in Spanish because she'd grown up with a different kind, and she thought if she cursed at it in a language it didn't understand, it couldn't be offended. A pause. It was stupid. Papa used to laugh at her for it. He stopped. His throat moved. She sounds like someone worth missing, Eliza said quietly. Yeah, he said. She was. He went back up the cellar stairs without another word, and Eliza stood in the low lamplight with her inventory sheet and her pencil, and the distinct, careful understanding that something had just shifted. Not healed, not resolved, but shifted, the way tectonic things shift, and that the shift was significant even if she couldn't yet see its full shape. She finished the inventory and came upstairs and made supper, and nobody mentioned the cellar conversation. Not that evening, not after. But Caleb passed her the salt at supper without being asked, and she thanked him, and he said, Mom, and Pearl observed this with her enormous dark eyes from across the table and said nothing. Gideon noticed. She could tell by the particular way he was careful not to react to it, which was itself a kind of reaction. She kept her face neutral and ate her supper. The week before Christmas, Frank Kellerman made his 4th offer on the eastern pasture. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He sent a letter, which arrived at the settlement post, and which Henry Dodd delivered personally, in itself a statement, on a gray Wednesday morning. Gideon read it at the kitchen table with Eliza across from him doing accounts, and she watched his face do the careful, shuttered thing it did when he was containing something. He set the letter down. They've gone up, he said. How much? He told her. It was a significant number, more than she'd expected, more than she suspected the eastern pasture strictly warranted, which meant it wasn't really about the pasture. They want the creek access, she said. If they get the eastern pasture, they get it by default. The boundary... He drew a line on the account book margin with his finger. They've thought this through. Have they made the same kind of offer to anyone else in the valley? He looked at her. What do you mean? If they're positioning themselves for the creek access, it's not just about your land. The Harlan Creek runs past 4 properties before it reaches theirs. Are they buying up pieces of all of them, or just trying to get yours? A pause. She could see him following the thought, running it against what he knew of the valley's geography and the Kellerman's history. I don't know, he said slowly. The Denton family sold their south section in September. I thought it was just... He stopped. Thought it was just financial trouble, she said. Yes. Was the Denton section on the creek? He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she'd come to recognize as the one where he was recalculating something and not particularly comfortable with where the calculation was landing. Yes, he said. And the Pryor family? Do they have creek frontage? Some. Eastern edge of their property. Are they having trouble? The Pryors are always having some kind of trouble. He paused. More recently, maybe. She said it carefully. If someone controls enough of the creek access, they control the grazing routes for most of the southern valley. Every family that depends on that water becomes dependent on whoever controls it. She paused. Including you. The kitchen was very quiet. I need to talk to Thomas Pryor, Gideon said, and the Denton family, and whoever else has property on that water. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the letter, not at her, But there was something in his posture that was different, less isolated, she thought, less alone with it, as if the problem, being shared, had become a problem that could conceivably be managed rather than simply endured. "You're good at this," he said. It came out slightly surprised, which she found she didn't take offense at. He was a man who didn't say things he didn't mean, which meant when he said something, it landed with the weight of something actually considered. "My father kept bad books," she said. "I learned to read numbers early because it was that or not know what was happening." He looked at her then, a longer look than usual, and in it something she'd been seeing more frequently and still couldn't quite name, something that was partly respect and partly something else, and partly, she thought, something he himself hadn't fully decided what to do with. "I'll ride out to Pryor's tomorrow," he said. "I'll keep working on the accounts while you're gone. There are some other things I want to look at." He nodded, then, after a moment, "Thank you." "It's a practical matter," she said. The phrase she'd used their first day, in this same kitchen, both of them different people then, in small but significant ways. He looked at her, and something crossed his face. The faintest, most contained thing, almost not there at all. That might have been, if she was reading it right, the beginning of a smile. He stood up and took his coffee and went out to the yard, and she looked at the account books and did not allow herself to read too much into anything, which was a discipline she was getting very good at, and that was costing her more than she cared to examine closely. Outside, the snow had started again, fine and dry, the kind that whispered against the window glass rather than striking it. The valley was filling in, turning white and quiet and deep. She turned a page in the account book and kept working. The story of Black Hollow Ranch was not a simple one, and she'd known that from the beginning. The grief in it was real and ongoing. The suspicion was real. The outside pressure was real. And the question of what she was building here, what all of them were building, even when they didn't know they were doing it together, was still very much unanswered. But here were the facts of it, as she understood them in December, 6 weeks in. The fence line held. The livestock was in better condition than it had been in September. The root cellar was properly counted and the shortfalls planned for. There was more wood stacked against the barn than there had been. Pearl was drawing pictures and talking more than anyone had heard her talk in 2 years. Caleb had shown her his grip on an axe handle and meant it as something other than contempt. And Gideon Hale had looked at her across a kitchen table and said, "Thank you," with the particular weight of a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean. It was not enough to call it anything. It was enough to keep going. She turned another page. The snow came down, and Black Hollow Ranch held. The storm came on a Friday, which Eliza would later think was almost too predictable. The worst things always seemed to arrive at the end of the week, when you were already tired and your reserves were already thinner than you'd like. It came down out of the northern range in the late afternoon, moving faster than anyone had read from the morning sky. And by the time the light went, it had swallowed the valley whole. She'd been watching it build since mid-afternoon from the kitchen window, the way the clouds piled up behind the highest ridge like something being stacked by a careless hand, dark and swollen and moving with a purpose that weather didn't technically have but sometimes seemed to. She'd put extra wood in before dark. She'd made sure the animals in the near paddock were moved to the barn. She'd told Pearl to stay inside and told Caleb the same, and he'd looked at her like she'd suggested he stop breathing, but he'd stayed. Gideon had gone out after supper to check the herd in the north pasture. He'd said he'd be an hour. That had been 2 hours ago. She was at the window for the 4th time in 20 minutes when Caleb appeared beside her. "He should be back," he said. His voice was flat and controlled in the way that in him meant the opposite. "I know. It's bad out there. I know." She turned from the window. "Stay with Pearl." He looked at her sharply. "You're not. Someone has to go look, and you need to be here with your sister." She said it practically, not as an order, because she'd learned by now that Caleb responded to practicality better than authority. "If I'm not back in an hour, ride to Mirabelle Hatches and get help. Do you understand?" He stood very still. "You don't know the North Pasture Trail." "I know it well enough." "At night in a whiteout, well enough isn't—" "Caleb." She looked at him directly. "Stay with Pearl." He clenched his jaw. Nodded once, the tight, reluctant nod of someone accepting something they don't agree with because they can't argue the logic of it. She put on her heaviest coat, her gloves, her scarf wrapped twice around her face, and she went out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical thing, not just temperature, but force, the wind coming sideways and hard, driving ice crystals that found every gap in her clothing and exploited it. She could see maybe 20 feet in front of her. Beyond that was white and movement and noise, the wind so loud it erased everything under it. She took the bay mare. Dolly was old and sensible mattered more than speed right now. She knew the North Pasture Trail by daylight and had ridden it enough times in the past 2 months that she trusted her own memory of it. But memory is a different thing in a whiteout, without landmarks, without the visual cues that you don't realize you're using until they're gone. She kept Dolly moving steadily and let the horse's instincts work alongside her own and tried to feel the shape of the ground through the mare's movement beneath her. She heard the cattle before she saw them, a low collective sound, animals in distress, and under it something else, a human voice she couldn't make words out of yet. She pressed Dolly forward, and the herd materialized out of the white ahead of her, the animals bunched tight and uneasy, and at their edge she found the source of the voice. Gideon was down, but was on his feet, barely. He'd been thrown, she could tell, or fallen when his horse spooked. The gelding was nowhere she could see, probably back toward the barn by now on instinct. Gideon was standing with one hand on a fence post and the other arm held tight against his body at an angle that told her immediately what had happened. And his face, when she got close enough to see it, was white and set and working very hard to stay composed. "Shoulder," he said, before she could ask. "I'm all right." "You're not all right." She dismounted and got to him, put her hand on his good arm. "Can you ride?" "I can ride." He couldn't, really. Not well, not safely, not with the shoulder clearly dislocated and possibly worse, but she got him onto Dolly and led the mare back toward the barn on foot through the storm, which was the longest half-mile she'd walked in her life, the wind pushing against her like it had a preference for her not getting where she was going. They made it. Caleb met them at the barn door. He took one look at his father, and the color left his face, and then he did what she'd come to recognize as his particular quality under pressure. He got useful. He got Dolly settled, he got a lantern, he helped her get Gideon into the barn, out of the worst of it. Gideon sat on a hay bale and breathed through what was clearly significant pain and said, "It's not as bad as it looks." "It's dislocated," Eliza said. She was already taking off her outer gloves, assessing with her hands and eyes. "Maybe more. I can't tell the rest until we get you inside. I need to check the cattle. The herd's unsettled if the storm pushes them toward the eastern fence. The herd is together, and they're not panicking," she said. "The fence on the eastern section is solid, you know that." She looked at him. "You can't ride with this shoulder. You know you can't." He knew. She could see it in his face, the knowledge and the cost of it, the particular grinding frustration of a man who cannot do the thing he needs to do and is trying to find a way to argue with physics. "The cattle," he said again, quieter. "I'll go back out and check them, after I see to your shoulder." She looked at Caleb. "Help me get him inside." What followed was not pleasant. She'd set a dislocated shoulder once before, her uncle's, after a fall from a wagon. And she knew the general mechanics of it, but knowing the mechanics and executing them in a warm kitchen with a man who was gritting his teeth and not quite managing to not make any noise were different propositions. Caleb held his father still and kept his face carefully expressionless, which was its own kind of courage. And Pearl sat in the doorway to the kitchen with her knees pulled to her chest and watched in the big-eyed, very still way she had when she was scared and trying not to show it. When it was done, and it was done right, the joint going back with the dull sound that she'd learned to expect and still didn't like, Gideon let out a long, controlled breath and sat for a moment with his head down. Then he straightened. "Thank you," he said. His voice was slightly unsteady and immediately wasn't. "I need to go check the herd," she said. He looked up. "Eliza." "I'll take the lantern. I know where they are." She was already pulling her coat back on. "Caleb, if there's a problem I can't handle alone, what's the signal?" Caleb had apparently accepted that arguing with her was a structural dead end. "3 shots with the rifle. Papa keeps it loaded over the door." "Good." She picked up the lantern. "Stay with your father." She went back out into the storm. The cattle were scared but intact. She spent 40 minutes with them, moving along the herd's edge, checking the fence line by feel, and by the lantern's limited light, talking to the animals the way her uncle had taught her, low and steady and without particular content, just the sound of a calm human voice doing its work. 2 of the younger steers had pushed toward the eastern corner, and she moved them back. A heifer. She'd been monitoring for the past week was showing signs that labor might be coming, which was bad timing of the highest order, but it wasn't immediate. She came back to the house snow-covered and so cold her face had gone past feeling cold into a kind of distant numbness that she didn't entirely trust. Gideon was at the kitchen table where she'd left him. His shoulder was bound and his color was slightly better, and he'd made himself a coffee with his good arm, which she took as a positive sign. He looked at her when she came in, really looked, the way he did sometimes, the assessing look that had changed over the months into something that assessed different things than it used to. Herd's all right, she said. The Callaway heifer is close. I'll check her in the morning. Sit down, he said. You're half frozen. I'm fine. Eliza. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite a request. Sit down. She sat. He slid the coffee toward her and she picked it up with both hands and let the heat move through her palms and thought that she was, actually, very tired. That was the night the storm became something more than a storm. Because at 2 in the morning, Caleb came down the stairs in a controlled near panic and said the words that reordered everything. The cattle were gone. Not the near paddock animals. Not the barn stock. The main herd. The North Pasture herd. The 43 head that represented the spine of Black Hollow Ranch's income. The herd that Gideon had spent 2 years maintaining through grief and difficulty and every kind of pressure the valley could bring to bear. Gone. The North Pasture fence was cut on the eastern side, and the trail in the snow, what trail the storm had left before covering it, ran east toward the high timber road that cut through the back of the Kellerman property. The word cut was what made Eliza's chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Fences that fell down left different marks than fences that were cut. Caleb had been to the pasture to check on the heifer, and he'd seen it, and he'd known, and he'd come back with the particular look of a boy who has just crossed into a different understanding of how the world works. How long ago? Gideon was already on his feet, his face gone rigid. The snows filled in the tracks some. Maybe 2 hours? Maybe 3. Gideon reached for his coat with his good arm, and Eliza put herself between him and the door. He looked at her. Move. You can't ride, she said. You can't rope. You can't handle a rifle. You can barely lift your arm. If you ride out after 43 head of stolen cattle in a blizzard with one working shoulder, you will fall off your horse somewhere in the dark, and nobody will find you until spring. She held his gaze. You know that's true. The expression on his face was something she'd never seen from him before. Raw and furious, and underneath the fury, something that was almost despair, the look of a man seeing everything he's fought for being taken away from him and being told he cannot fight back. They're my cattle, he said. Very quiet, very flat. I know. That herd is... He stopped. His jaw worked. I know what that herd is, she said. That's why I'm going. The room went absolutely silent. Caleb looked at her. Gideon looked at her. I know the Eastern Trail, she said. I've ridden it twice with you to check the boundary markers. I know where it meets the high timber road. And I know who controls the supply routes on the other side of that timber road. She paused. Silas Webb. Gideon stared at her. You're not going to Silas Webb. I am. Eliza Webb is not a man you walk up to at 2 in the morning in a blizzard and make requests of. He doesn't... He paused, choosing words. He doesn't operate the way regular people operate. He controls who moves what through those passes, and he has his own understanding of how the valley works, and it is not... I know what he is, she said. I've been listening to this valley talk for 3 months. I know what Silas Webb is. She looked at Gideon steadily. And I know that the cattle have to go through his territory to get anywhere worth taking them. Which means he either knows about this or he doesn't, and either way, he's the lever point. Gideon looked at her for a long time. The storm was loud against the windows. His shoulder was clearly hurting him, and he was running on pain and fury and the particular helplessness of a man who is used to acting and cannot. He won't deal with a woman, he said finally. Not dismissively. She could hear that he was saying it as information, a warning. He'll deal with whoever shows up, she said, and nobody else is showing up. Another silence. Caleb had not moved. His face was doing something complicated. Take the rifle, Gideon said. It was not agreement so much as the absence of another option, and she understood the difference. Yes. And take... He stopped. Looked at Caleb. I'm not sending Caleb, she said. I wasn't going to suggest it. He looked at her. Take the compass from the shelf by the door. The Eastern Trail branches twice before it hits the timber road. You want the left fork both times. Left both times. Don't make promises to Webb you can't keep. He remembers everything. I understand. He reached out with his good arm and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Just for a moment, just a touch, but deliberate. His hand was large and warm, and she felt it through the layers of her coat. Be careful, he said. It was not a small thing, from him. She knew that. I will, she said, and went to get the rifle and the compass and the horse. The eastern trail in a blizzard at 2 in the morning was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds, and considerably worse than she'd prepared herself for. She took Gideon's gelding. He'd found his way back to the barn, as she'd hoped, and was considerably faster than Dolly on rough terrain. She kept her head down against the wind and her mind on the forks, left and then left again, and the timber road would be there. It was there, barely visible, the trees on either side cutting the wind enough that she could breathe properly, and she pushed on through the dark with the lantern swinging from the saddle horn and the rifle across her lap, and the cold so deep by now it had become simply a condition of existence rather than an active discomfort. She found the tracks 40 minutes in, boot prints and hoof prints in the sheltered hollow where the storm hadn't fully reached, and she followed them east through the timber until the tree cover opened and she saw the light. Silas Webb's place was not what she'd expected, and also was exactly what she'd expected, which was a kind of low-built compound of several structures that looked like they'd been added to over decades without any particular plan, backed up against a rock shelf that cut the north wind, with a fire going inside that showed in the windows and a dog that announced her presence before she'd gotten within 50 yards. She sat on the horse and waited. You didn't approach Webb's place without being invited. She knew that much from the valley talk. The door opened. A big man filled it. Not Webb himself, she didn't think. Someone younger, with a rifle already in hand. State your business, he said. My name is Eliza Mercer. I'm from Black Hollow Ranch. I need to speak with Silas Webb. Webb doesn't take visitors at this hour. I know that. I'm asking anyway. A pause. The man looked at her. On a horse, in a blizzard, a rifle across her lap, alone at 2 in the morning, and apparently that combination of facts communicated something, because he stepped back inside. She waited. Another light appeared, moving through the compound, and then Silas Webb came out. I was smaller than she'd imagined, a compact, weathered man of perhaps 60, with white hair and a face that had been carved into its expression by decades of weather and calculation. He wore no coat against the cold, which was either deliberate or simply told you something about what he was used to. His eyes moved over her with the quick, precise attention of someone who has assessed a great many situations and gotten good at it. Black Hollow Ranch, he said. Gideon Hale's place. Yes. He send you? No, I made the decision to come. Something flickered in his eyes. Interest, maybe, or the precursor to it. That's a notable distinction. 43 head of Black Hollow cattle were stolen tonight. The trail leads east through your territory. They can't be moved out of the valley without going through your supply routes. She kept her voice even. She was terrified, in a cold, managed way, but terror and composure were not, she'd found, mutually exclusive. I'm not asking you for charity. I'm asking you for business. What kind of business? Tell me where those cattle are, and if you have men who can help bring them back, I'll negotiate a fair rate right now. Black Hollow accounts through your supply routes for the next 2 seasons. Exclusive routing on ranch goods. A silence. The wind moved through the trees above them. That's a significant offer from someone who doesn't own the ranch, Webb said. I'm authorized to negotiate, she said, which was not exactly true and also not exactly false, because Gideon had said, don't make promises you can't keep, and she fully intended to keep this one. Webb looked at her for a long moment. The fire behind him in the window shifted and changed. I know where those cattle are, he said. She kept her face very still. The men who moved them came through this road 2 hours ago. I don't do business with thieves on my territory without knowing who they are. He paused. I was going to deal with it in the morning. It's morning enough, she said. Something crossed his face that was not a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. You ride like you know what you're doing. I know what I'm doing. Gideon Hale doesn't know you're here. He'll know in the morning. And if this goes wrong, then it goes wrong, and I deal with it. She met his eyes directly. Mr. Webb, those cattle are the difference between that ranch surviving the winter and not. I don't have time to wait for morning, and I don't have time to be careful in the way you're suggesting I should be. So I'm asking you, will you help me or not? The wind came through in a long gust. Webb looked at her with the measuring expression that she imagined he used on everything: people, deals, weather, risk. And she held herself still and let him look. 2 seasons exclusive routing, he said finally. Yes. And I want the agreement in writing by end of the week. You'll have it. He turned back to the compound and raised his voice. Carver, Russ, get the horses. It took an hour and a half, in the grinding cold of a nearly spent blizzard, with Webb's 2 men and Eliza working the terrain, and 2 dogs who turned out to be extraordinarily good at their particular job. The cattle were in a box canyon 2 miles east, penned in by timber rails that hadn't been there a week ago, which meant this had been planned and the storm chosen deliberately for cover, which in turn meant Frank Kellerman, or someone working for him, had been watching Black Hollow Ranch and waiting for exactly the right conditions. She filed that away for later. Moving 43 cold, unhappy cattle through the tail end of a blizzard on a trail that was barely a trail in daylight was a physical argument that lasted the entire return trip, and she lost it in small ways repeatedly. An animal turning the wrong direction, a section of the group splitting off, the horses slipping on ice beneath the snow, and won it in the only way that mattered, which was that by the time the sky was going gray at the edges, they were coming down the slope into Black Hollow's north pasture, the fence repaired behind them with wire that Webb's man Carver carried as a matter of habit, and the number was still 43. Gideon was at the pasture gate. He'd been there a while, she thought. There was snow on his hat and his shoulders that hadn't just accumulated. He was standing very straight despite the shoulder, watching the cattle come down through the gray morning light, with an expression that she couldn't look at directly because it was too open, too much of him visible in it, and she wasn't sure she had the right to that yet. She rode up to him and stopped. 43, she said. He looked up at her on the horse. The light was growing behind the mountains, pale and cold and clean. Kellerman, he said. Someone working for him. I don't know if you can prove it. He nodded, slowly. He was looking at the cattle, but she didn't think he was really seeing them. Webb helped you. 2 seasons exclusive routing on ranch goods, she said. I told him you'd put it in writing by end of the week. A pause. That's a significant commitment. It's a fair price, she said, and we can afford it better than we can afford losing the herd. He looked at her then. Fully, without the careful management he usually brought to looking at her, and there was something in his face that she'd only seen pieces of before, never the whole of it. The weight of everything he'd been carrying, and the particular complicated quality of watching someone carry some of it with you when you'd been carrying it alone for long enough that you'd stopped believing anyone could. Eliza, he said, then stopped. She waited. I don't... He stopped again. Gideon Hale was not a man who struggled for words as a rule, and she watched him struggle and felt the weight of it. I didn't ask you to do this. I know. You could have been... He stopped a third time, and she understood that what he wasn't finishing was something like hurt, or worse, and that the not finishing of it was its own kind of statement. I'm not, she said simply. I'm here, and the cattle are here, and the fence is fixed. That's what matters. He looked at her for another long moment. The morning was brightening, and behind him the valley was filling in with pale gray-gold light, and it was, despite everything, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful after you've been afraid and come through the other side. Come inside, he said finally. You need to warm up. I need to check the Callaway heifer first. Something crossed his face. Frustration, resignation, something else she couldn't name. Of course you do, he said, and it wasn't quite what she'd have expected it to mean. There was something almost gentle in it. She put the gelding away and went to check the heifer, who had delivered in the night, without complications, a healthy calf that was already standing on uncertain legs in the hay. She stood and looked at them for a moment. The heifer calm and attentive, the calf working out the logistics of being new, and felt the exhaustion come down over her all at once, the kind that waits politely until the crisis is over and then arrives without apology. She put her forehead briefly against the heifer's warm neck. Good girl, she said quietly. Then she straightened up and went to the house. Caleb was at the kitchen table when she came in. He stood up when he saw her, a quick, instinctive movement, and then apparently remembered he was 13 and supposed to be composed about things, and sat back down. But she'd seen it. All of them? He asked. All 43. She sat down heavily across from him. And a calf. The Callaway heifer delivered last night. Something moved across his face. Pride or something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of your ranch producing life on a night when someone tried to take from it. Papa's shoulder? She asked. Worse in the morning than last night. He won't say so. He wouldn't. She looked at the stove. Is there coffee? I made some, he said, and he got up and poured her a cup and set it in front of her. And that small act, Caleb, doing something for her without being asked, was in its own way more significant than the 43 cattle and the 2-hour blizzard ride and the negotiation with Silas Webb. She didn't make anything of it. She drank her coffee. Pearl came downstairs at 7:30 and found Eliza at the table and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. And then she crossed the room and stood beside Eliza's chair and put her small hand on Eliza's arm. She didn't say anything. Pearl rarely said the things she meant out loud, but she stood there with her hand on Eliza's arm, and that was a kind of language too. The heifer had her calf, Eliza told her. Pearl's eyes went wide. Is it all right? She's healthy, standing up already. Pearl looked at the door, then at Eliza, clearly calculating the distance between here and the barn and the probability of being allowed to go. After breakfast, Eliza said. Pearl sat down and folded her hands and waited with the focused patience of someone who has been given a clear timeline and intends to hold you to it. Gideon came in from wherever he'd been and sat at the head of the table, and his face was set against whatever his shoulder was doing to him, and he said nothing about the night's events. He drank his coffee and looked at Eliza once with the look she still couldn't fully translate, and then looked at his children and asked Pearl if she'd slept. Outside, the storm had fully gone. The valley lay clean and white and silent under a sky that had gone the deep, washed blue of after bad weather, and the light coming in the kitchen window was the particular gold of winter morning when the sun finally arrives after absence. Black Hollow Ranch sat in that light, 43 head intact, 1 new calf, 1 damaged shoulder, 1 cracked fence repaired with borrowed wire. It was not a victory with any shine to it. It was the messy, exhausted, imperfect kind that doesn't feel like winning so much as surviving, and surviving with enough left over to keep going. That was enough. Eliza Mercer drank her coffee and felt the warmth of it move through her hands, and thought about the things that had not broken, and about the calf standing up on uncertain legs in the hay, and about the particular quality of Gideon Hale's voice when he'd said her name in the pasture gate light. The way it had something in it she hadn't heard from him before and didn't yet have a word for. She was tired down to her bones. She stayed at the table. The days after the storm had a particular quality to them, the quiet that follows something violent, when the world has rearranged itself and everyone is still figuring out what the new arrangement means. The valley lay white and still under January skies, and Black Hollow Ranch moved through its routines with the careful steadiness of a household that has been through something and is not yet ready to talk about it. Gideon's shoulder healed slowly, the way injuries do in men who refuse to rest properly. 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Improvement interrupted regularly by him doing something he shouldn't, because there were things that needed doing and he was constitutionally incapable of watching someone else do them without involving himself. Eliza said nothing about this, mostly. Occasionally she said something small and practical, like you'll set it back if you lift that, or let Caleb handle the water troughs today, and he would look at her with the particular expression of a man who knows he's being managed and is choosing not to fight it, because fighting it requires energy. He's currently directing elsewhere. It was progress, of a kind. The valley, meanwhile, had gotten the story. She didn't know exactly how. The Webb territory talk, most likely, or Carver or Russ mentioning it in passing somewhere it could travel. But within a week of the night ride, the Harlan settlement knew the outline of what had happened. 43 head stolen in a blizzard. The woman from Black Hollow riding out alone in the dark. Silas Webb's involvement, which was the part people found most remarkable, because Webb was not known for involving himself in other people's situations without significant personal benefit, and the fact that he had, and that a girl of 18 had somehow arranged it, required recalibration of several assumptions. Mirabelle Hatch arrived on a Tuesday with soup and a barely contained excitement that she was trying, with limited success, to dress as concern. Clara Voss is not speaking to Henry Dodd, she announced, settling herself at the kitchen table. Because Dodd told the Pryor family what happened, and the Pryors told the Garfields, and apparently Clara had told the Garfields the week before that you'd be gone by spring, and now she looks foolish. I'd rather Clara Voss look foolish quietly, Eliza said, because she meant it. Mirabelle waved a hand. What I'm saying is that people are talking differently now. That's all. She looked at Eliza with an expression that had genuine warmth in it, which Mirabelle didn't always fully commit to. What you did was something. What I did was retrieve the ranch's property, Eliza said. It needed doing. Eliza. Mirabelle set down her spoon. Half the men in this valley wouldn't have ridden to Webb's place alone in that storm. You know that. Eliza did know that. She just didn't find it particularly useful to dwell on, because dwelling on the difficulty of a thing you'd already done was a waste of the energy you needed for the next thing. How's the Pryor family managing? She said, redirecting. Mirabelle accepted the redirect with the ease of a woman who has learned that Eliza redirects when she's uncomfortable, and that the redirect is usually towards something worth following. Poorly. Thomas Pryor's been offered something similar to what the Kellermans offered Gideon, and Thomas doesn't have Gideon's stubbornness to help him resist it. He'll lose the creek frontage. Yes. Eliza thought about this for a moment. Then she said, What does Thomas Pryor need most right now? Mirabelle looked at her. Why? Because if the Kellermans are buying access to the creek one property at a time, the only thing that stops them is if the families on that water stop being individually vulnerable. She paused. Which means they need to stop being individual. Mirabelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said slowly, You're talking about a cooperative arrangement. I'm talking about the obvious solution that nobody's organized because everyone's been too busy surviving separately to think about surviving together. Eliza looked at her. You know these families. Which ones are still in a position to act? Mirabelle studied her with an expression that was shifting into something more serious than the one she'd arrived with. The Garfields, the Pryors, if you catch Thomas before he signs anything. The Denton families lost their south section, but they still have the North Creek access. The Halverson brothers. She paused. Gideon, Eliza agreed. He'd have to be the one to bring them together. People in this valley will follow Gideon Hale somewhere he's willing to lead them. They've just been waiting for him to be willing. Eliza nodded slowly. She'd understood for a while now that Gideon's isolation since Ruth's death had cost the valley something beyond Black Hollow itself. That he was a person people took their bearing from, and that his withdrawal had left a kind of vacancy in the community's navigation. She'd been careful not to say this to him directly, because it wasn't her place to say, and because he was the kind of man who had to arrive at things himself to fully act on them. But maybe the time for being careful about that was ending. She talked to him that evening after supper, after the children had gone upstairs. Pearl to bed, Caleb to the loft space he'd claimed above his own room, where he went when he wanted to think without anyone watching him do it. She and Gideon sat at the kitchen table with the account books between them, which had become their evening habit, the lamp turned up enough to read by, the fire going low and steady. She laid it out for him plainly. The creek access strategy, the individual vulnerability of each family, the collective solution. She told him what Mirabelle had said and didn't dress it up as her own conclusion when it was a combination of both. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. I've been thinking about something similar, he said finally. I know. He looked up. You've been thinking about it since December, she said, when we talked about the Denton land sale. You went quiet in the way you go quiet when you're working something through and not ready to say it yet. He looked at her with an expression she was getting better at reading, which was the one where she'd said something accurate about him, and he wasn't sure how he felt about being that legible to someone. Thomas Pryor won't hold long on his own, he said. No. I'll write out to him this week. He paused. And the Garfields? Halverson? I'll send a letter. They're more likely to come to a meeting if they feel like they've had time to think about it. That's probably right. She watched him. Gideon, when you go, you should go as yourself, not just as someone protecting Black Hollow. They need to see you showing up for the valley, not just for your own land. I was quiet again. This one was a different kind of quiet. Not the working through kind, but the kind that meant something had been said that was true, and he was sitting with the truth of it. Ruth used to say something like that, he said finally. Very quiet. She said I got so focused on what was in front of me, I forgot to look up and see what was around me. Eliza said nothing. She kept her face still and let the moment be what it was. She was right, he said. She usually was. She sounds like she was, Eliza said carefully. He looked at her then, and in his face was something she hadn't seen from him before in this particular combination. Grief and something else. Something she didn't want to name incorrectly. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the books. "I'll ride to Pryor's Thursday," he said. She nodded, and they went back to the accounts, and the fire burned down, and the night outside was cold and clear, and she thought about Ruth Hale in a way she tried not to let herself do too often, not with jealousy or resentment, which would have been small of her and false, but with the complicated, careful feeling of a woman walking a path that someone else walked first, trying to find her own footprints in it. It was Caleb who broke first. She hadn't expected it to be him. Or she had. She'd seen the pressure building in him for weeks, since the night of the storm, since the cattle came back, since something had shifted in the house's atmosphere that everyone could feel and no one was addressing. He'd been quieter than usual, which with Caleb meant nearly invisible, doing his work with the focused efficiency of someone using occupation as a substitute for something else. She was in the barn on a Wednesday afternoon in late January, working on the saddle that had been needing repair since November, when she heard him come in. She knew his step by now. Everyone's step on Black Hollow had become familiar the way sounds do in a place you live long enough. She kept working. He didn't say anything for a while. She heard him moving around on the other side of the barn, doing something with the tack, and the silence had a texture to it that she recognized. Finally he said, "You're staying." She looked up. He was standing on the other side of the center aisle with a bridle in his hands, not looking at her. "That's my intention," she said, "even after the storm and Webb and all of it. Especially after that." He was quiet. He hung the bridle on its hook and stood with his back to her for a moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." He turned around. His face was doing the thing it did when he was 14 going on 40, trying to be composed and not quite managing it, the seams of it showing. "When my mother was sick, at the end, not the very end, but the part before that when she could still talk, mostly, she told me something." He stopped, looked at the hay on the floor. "She told me that Papa wasn't going to be all right on his own. She said it wasn't in him, the kind of alone she was about to leave him in. She said he'd close up like a—" He paused, remembering the word. "Like a winter plant. She said he'd close up and the ranch would go with him eventually, and he'd never ask for help because he didn't know how." Eliza set down the saddle. "She told me to watch out for him," Caleb said. "She made me promise. I was 12. He looked up then, and his eyes were bright in the barn light, and he was clearly furious about that and working to stay steady. "I've been trying to keep that promise for 2 years, and I haven't done it well. I know that. I know I've been—" He stopped. "I've been so afraid of what would happen if the wrong person showed up that I couldn't look at whether you were the wrong person or not. I just decided you were." She waited. "You're not," he said. It came out rougher than he'd intended. "You're not the wrong person, and I've known that for a while now, and I didn't say it, and I should have said it before now, and I'm saying it now because—" He ran out of sentence, which happened to him sometimes when he'd been holding something a long time and finally put it down. She stood up and crossed the barn aisle and did something she'd never done before. She put her arms around him, and he was stiff for exactly 1 second, and then he wasn't, and he was still several inches shorter than he'd be in 2 years, and she could feel in the thinness of his shoulders the particular vulnerability of a boy who has been carrying a man's weight for too long. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on the silence. He pulled back after a moment and turned away and did something with his face that involved looking at the ceiling and blinking several times. "Mama used to swear at the stove in Spanish," he said, which was the second time he'd told her that, and she understood that it was his way of offering Ruth Hale to her, not as a competitor, but as a person. "You told me," she said. It was embarrassing. She'd learned about 10 words and she used all of them on that stove. "What were the words?" He glanced at her, something that was almost a smile. "I'm not repeating them." "Fair enough." He picked up the bridle again, unnecessarily, just to have something in his hands. "I don't know what this—" He gestured vaguely between them and at the house. "I don't know what to call it." "You don't have to call it anything," she said. "It can just be what it is." He seemed to find that acceptable. He nodded at the saddle she'd been working on. "The left billet strap needs replacing too, not just the keeper." She looked. He was right. "Good eye." "I've been looking at that saddle since October," he said. "You're slow." "I've been busy." He almost smiled again. He went back to work, and she went back to work, and the barn was quiet around them with the particular warmth of a space full of animals and hay and the smell of old wood, and something that had been wrong in the house for 5 months was, if not right exactly, at least moved in the direction of right. She told Gideon about it that evening in the spare way she told him things, the outline of it, without the parts that were Caleb's alone to own. He listened. When she finished, he was looking at the lamp, and in his face was the most undefended expression she'd seen from him, the grief and the love and the relief all present at once, nothing managed or contained. He's been carrying that promise alone, Gideon said. Yes. I didn't know she asked that of him. He didn't want to tell you. He thought it would... She paused. He thought you'd feel guilty. I do feel guilty. I know. She looked at him steadily. That's different from him having been wrong to carry it. He loved her, and he was trying to keep her close in the only way she gave him. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. I owe him a conversation. You do, but not tonight, I don't think. Give him a day or two to settle. He nodded. Then, you understand him better than I do. You understand him in ways I never will, she said. You're his father. What I have is just distance. Sometimes distance helps you see the shape of things. He looked at her. You're very careful, he said slowly, about not taking up more space than you think you're allowed. The observation landed with the particular quality of something accurate said by someone you didn't expect to see you that clearly. Old habit, she said. It's not necessary here, he said, quiet and direct. The way he said things when he'd decided to say them. She held his gaze for a moment. I'm still figuring out what's necessary and what isn't, she said honestly. I'll get there. He nodded, and they went back to the books, and she didn't examine the warmth that had settled somewhere behind her sternum, because examining it would require naming it, and she wasn't ready to name it yet. The meeting of the Valley families happened on a Saturday in early February at Black Hollow Ranch, which was Gideon's suggestion, and which Eliza recognized as significant in a way she didn't comment on. He could have suggested the settlement hall or the Garfield property, which was more central. He chose his own land, which was a statement whether or not he intended it as one. This is where I stand. 7 families came. The Pryors, the Garfields, the Halverson brothers, and their wives, the Denton family minus the southern section they'd already lost. 2 other families from the Upper Valley, whose names Eliza had known from the account books, but whom she met in person for the first time. Mirabelle Hatch came because Mirabelle Hatch went everywhere that mattered, and everyone knew it, and nobody tried to stop her anymore. Eliza cooked for all of them. 2 days of preparation, Pearl helping more than Eliza had expected, and Caleb appearing in the kitchen on Saturday morning with the unconvincing air of someone who happened to be passing through repeatedly and not someone who wanted to be asked to carry things. She did not sit at the table when the men talked. That was not a decision anyone imposed on her. It was simply the way of things in this valley, in this time, and she understood the landscape she was working in well enough to know which battles were worth fighting directly and which ones you won sideways. She stayed in the kitchen within earshot and did not pretend she wasn't listening. She heard Gideon speak in a way she hadn't heard him speak before. To a room, to people, with the particular authority of a man who has stopped choosing silence. He laid out what he understood about the Kellerman strategy, the Creek Access Plan, the systematic pressure on individual properties. He said it plainly and without drama, and she could hear, in the quality of the quiet that followed, the room recalibrating. Thomas Pryor said he'd been 2 days from signing. The Denton family said they wished they'd had this conversation 4 months ago. The Halverson brothers said several things that were less polite than that. And then Gideon said, "There's a solution, if people are willing." He outlined what Eliza had outlined to him in the kitchen, and he outlined it well, and he attributed the thinking to her, which she had not expected and which produced a brief silence from the room and a longer one from inside herself. The woman negotiated with Webb, said one of the Halverson brothers, and it was not said with hostility. It was said the way you'd say something you were still adjusting to. She did, Gideon said, simply, without elaboration. Another silence. Then Thomas Pryor said, "What exactly is she proposing?" And Gideon said, "Why don't I ask her to come and explain it herself?" She came out of the kitchen and stood at the edge of the room and felt 14 pairs of eyes adjust to her presence. And she did not perform confidence or competence. She just stood there and said what she knew and what she thought and answered the questions that came directly and said, "I don't know when she didn't know," which happened twice and which she thought was more persuasive than pretending otherwise would have been. By the end of the afternoon, they had the outline of an agreement, shared access commitments, a collective response structure for any future offer on creek-adjacent land, and a plan to get a formal boundary survey done in the spring, with costs split among the participating families. It wasn't everything, it was a beginning. After everyone had eaten and the families had driven back into the winter dusk, Eliza stood at the kitchen window and washed dishes and listened to the house settle around her. Pearl was asleep upstairs. Caleb had gone to the barn. Gideon was at the table with the final notes from the afternoon, and the lamp was low and the fire was down to coals, and the quiet was the good kind, the kind that has earned itself. "You attributed the plan to me," she said, without turning from the window. "It was your plan. It was both of ours. The core of it was yours." She heard him set down his pencil. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It surprised me." "Why?" She dried her hands on the cloth and turned around. He was looking at her from the table with his direct, steady look, the one she'd learned meant he was paying full attention. "Because most men in your position would have presented it as their own," she said, "and it would have worked just as well either way." "It wouldn't have been true either way," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The lamplight was between them, warm and unsteady. "Gideon," she said. "Yes." "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is difficult." He waited. "Do you—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "When you think about what this is, the two of us, the arrangement, what you actually think of it now, not what you thought of it in October, do you think it can be something real, not just practical?" The silence was long enough that she had time to regret asking, but she'd asked because she was done being careful about the space she took up, and he had told her she didn't need to be. "Yes," he said. Just that, one word, the way he said things when he'd already done all the deciding, and the word was just the delivery of it. She held his gaze. "Okay," she said quietly. He nodded once, the same nod he used when something was settled and didn't need more words. She turned back to the dishes. She could hear him pick up his pencil. The warmth behind her sternum, which she had been carefully not naming, named itself. She washed the last of the dishes and set them to dry, and the fire went to ash and the lamp burned low, and Black Hollow Ranch held its breath around them. This man, and this woman, and the 2 children sleeping above them, and the 43 head in the north pasture, and the new calf in the hay and the valley outside that was just beginning, in the way that valleys do in February, to think about spring. There was still the matter of Kellerman. Still the legal question of what could be proven and what couldn't. Still Gideon's shoulder healing slower than it should, and the supply agreement with Webb to be put in writing, and a dozen other things that would need managing in the weeks ahead. But the house was warm, and the people in it were not healed, not simple, not any of the things that stories sometimes make them, but present and trying, and that was more than most people got. Caleb came in from the barn just before 9, stomping snow off his boots, and looked at Eliza at the counter, and at his father at the table, and at the room in general, with the particular acuity of a boy who has been watching the adults around him carefully for 2 years, and has learned to read what the room is doing. He said nothing about what he saw. He hung up his coat. He poured himself a glass of water. "The calf's doing well," he said, to both of them and neither of them. "Good," Gideon said. "I named her," Caleb said, with the aggressive casualness of someone expecting to be told that wasn't his call. "January, because of when she came." "That's a good name," Eliza said. Caleb looked at her. The look was not the old one, not the assessing, keep-your-distance look of the first months. It was something newer and less defended. "Yeah," he said, "I thought so." He went upstairs, and Gideon looked at the staircase where he'd been, and in his face was something that was tired and grateful and complicated in the way that loving your children is always complicated, full of the knowledge of what you've put them through and the hope that they're going to be all right anyway. "He'll be okay," Eliza said. "I know," Gideon said. "He gets that from his mother." She looked at him. He was looking at the stairs. "And the rest?" she said. He looked at her, and something in his face was more open than she'd seen it, more like a door left ajar than the closed and curtained thing it had been. "The rest," he said, "I'm still working on." It was honest, and it was enough. She turned off the lamp. They said good night. She went upstairs, and she stood at her window for a moment and looked out at the valley, white and dark and very large, with the stars out and the cold clean against the glass. She thought, "I am not where I expected to be." And then, "I am exactly where I need to be." She went to bed. Spring came to the Harlan Valley, the way it always does at altitude. Reluctantly, in fits and starts, the warmth arriving and then retreating for another week, as if it hadn't quite made up its mind yet. There were days in March when the meadow showed patches of green, and Eliza would stand at the kitchen window and think, "This is it. It's turning." And then the next morning she'd wake to another inch of snow, and the whole calculation would reset. By April, it was genuinely committed, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, the aspens putting out their first tentative leaves, the kitchen garden showing the green tips of the things she'd planted in faith back in February, when the ground was barely workable, and Caleb had watched her from the fence with an expression that said he respected the effort even if he thought the timing was optimistic. He'd stopped trying to hide that he respected her, mostly. It had happened gradually, in the way that real changes happen. Not a single moment, but an accumulation of them, each one small enough to deny, and together forming something undeniable. He still argued with her, which she'd come to understand was not hostility, but simply how he engaged with people he took seriously. He argued with his father the same way, she'd noticed, direct and unsparing, and when he was wrong about something he admitted it with the same directness, which was a quality not everyone managed to hold on to past the age of 13. Pearl had come further still. The child who had barely spoken when Eliza arrived now talked with the quiet, steady confidence of someone who has learned that her words have value and the people around her will make room for them. She still drew her mother in the small notebook, still brought the drawings to Eliza sometimes, still offered them in that wordless way that was its own language, and Eliza still received them seriously, and it had never once been complicated between them. Pearl was not Eliza's daughter. Ruth Hale was Pearl's mother, and always would be. Eliza was something else, something they'd built together without a word for it, and the absence of the word didn't make it less real. What had changed, in the months since the storm, and the cattle, and the February meeting, and all the small conversations that had accumulated between them, was that Black Hollow Ranch had stopped feeling like a place Eliza was staying and started feeling like a place she belonged to. And this distinction, which sounds simple, is actually one of the more significant distances a person can travel. The Kellerman situation resolved itself in March, not dramatically, but conclusively. Gideon had ridden out to the eastern boundary 3 times over the winter with Thomas Pryor and one of the Halverson brothers as witnesses, and they'd documented the fence cuts and the track evidence from the night of the storm with the methodical patience of men who know that the law in frontier territories moves slowly, but moves more surely when you give it something solid to hold. The Harlan Valley's circuit judge arrived in April for his quarterly visit, and the case Gideon laid before him was quiet and specific and well documented. Frank Kellerman did not go to jail. That was not the kind of justice the frontier dispensed easily, and Gideon had understood going in that what was available was not punishment, but consequence. What the judge produced was a formal boundary ruling, a restraining order on the Kellerman cattle from within 400 yards of Black Hollow's eastern fence line, and a finding of civil liability that cost the Kellermans enough money to make the eastern pasture acquisition considerably less attractive than it had been. It was not satisfying in the way that people sometimes want satisfaction. There was no confession, no moment of public reckoning, no clean ending. Frank Kellerman moved through the Harlan settlement that spring with the careful dignity of a man who has been handed a loss and is determined not to show it, and Gideon moved through it the same way he always moved, without performance, without triumph, head down, and working. But the creek access plan died. The Pryor family kept their land. The collective agreement that had been hammered out at the February meeting held through the spring and started to look, by May, like something that might actually last. When the Denton family discovered that the south section they'd sold under pressure the previous autumn had been purchased at below market value through a deliberate scheme, they brought their own complaint before the circuit judge. And the judge, who had now heard enough about Frank Kellerman to have developed his own opinions, was receptive. The valley remembered these things, and it remembered who had started the conversation. Henry Dodd, who had delivered Kellerman's letter to Black Hollow with the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news, made a point of being cordial to Eliza at the settlement store in May. She was cordial back. She didn't carry grudges, not because she was saintly about it, but because carrying grudges was work, and she had a great deal of other work and limited capacity for the optional kind. Clara Voss remained silent on the subject of Eliza Mercer, which in the particular social economy of the Harlan settlement was its own form of concession. Mirabelle Hatch said, arriving at Black Hollow on a Tuesday in June with pie this time rather than soup, a distinction Eliza noted as a shift from charity to friendship. You know, people are saying you're the reason the valley held together this winter. People are giving me credit for things that were already there, Eliza said. The families on that creek were always capable of working together. They just needed a reason to start. You were the reason. Gideon was the reason. I just handed him the argument. Mirabelle set down the pie and looked at her with the expression of someone who has decided to say something they've been thinking for a while. You do that, she said. You hand people the argument and then you step back and let them carry it, like you're not sure you're allowed to be the one holding it yourself. Eliza looked at her. Mirabelle was sharper than she let on most of the time, which was probably a strategic choice. I'm working on that, Eliza said. Work faster, Mirabelle said pleasantly. The valley needs people who'll hold things, not just hand them off. She left the pie and went home, and Eliza stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about what it meant to be allowed to hold something. To stake a claim not just to labor, but to the thing the labor builds. She'd spent 18 years making herself useful to other people's situations. Her father's household, her uncle's ranch, and now here. And somewhere in the practice of being useful, she'd developed the habit of treating belonging as something you had to earn continuously, every day, or it would be taken away. The habit was old and it was stubborn, and she was only beginning to understand how much of her own life it had quietly managed without her permission. She put the pie on the shelf and went back to work. The conversation she had had with Gideon in February. The careful, minimal one, yes and okay, and I'm still working on it, had not been followed immediately by anything. That was right, she thought, even when it was hard. Some things need space before they can develop into their full shape, and Gideon was not a man who rushed himself about things that mattered. I was working through something that took time, the transition from a grief that had organized his whole interior life for 2 years into something that had room in it for the present. You couldn't hurry that, and you shouldn't try, and she had her own patience, developed by years of learning to wait out the things that couldn't be pushed. What she noticed, instead of declarations, was the daily accumulation of small choices he made that meant something without being announced. He asked her opinion on things he'd previously decided alone. He told her things about the ranch's history. Not frequently, not in any systematic way, just when something came up and the context made it natural. And in those tellings she could feel him giving her the place's past as a kind of welcome to its future. He started sleeping in the house again, in his own room, sometime in March. He didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. He laughed once, in April, at something she said about the geldings' terrible opinion of mud, and the laugh was genuine and unguarded and over quickly, and he looked slightly surprised at himself, the way people do when they've done something they haven't done in a long time and find they still can. She counted that very carefully. The evening it came to a proper head was in late May, after supper, on the porch. Pearl had gone inside to draw. Caleb was in the barn, which was where Caleb always was when he had something to think about, and the thinking was usually about the future. She'd had enough conversations with him by now to know that he was already planning the ranch in his head, the way ranchers do from the time they're old enough to understand that land is something you make decisions about. He had opinions about which sections of the pasture were being underused, about whether Black Hollow should expand the herd or diversify into horses, about the drainage problem on the north slope that she'd also identified but not mentioned to Gideon yet, because she'd been letting Caleb come to it in his own time. I was underneath all the difficulty of the first months, a genuinely impressive person. She didn't say that to him because he'd have deflected it and possibly found it embarrassing, but she thought it, and she thought that Gideon should find more ways to say it to him, and she'd said this to Gideon in those terms, and he had listened in the way he listened when he was going to do something about it. The porch faced west, and in late May the light went long and golden before it finally gave up, laying itself across the meadow in long flat bands that turned the grass the color of something valuable. They'd been sitting quietly for a while, she and Gideon side by side in the 2 chairs that had been there as long as anyone could remember. And the comfortable quality of the quiet was not something she took for granted because she remembered the early silences and knew the difference. He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "When you came here," he said slowly, "what did you think was going to happen?" She thought about it honestly. "I thought I was going to work hard and be useful and carve out a place for myself," she said. "I thought it would be difficult and probably lonely and probably practical in all the ways that matter, and not much else. And? And it was difficult, she said, and lonely for a while. But not only that. No, she said, not only that. I was looking at the meadow, at the gold light on the grass and the dark hills beyond, and the sky going amber and then rose at the edge of the world. His hands were on his knees, and she could see the old scar on his right hand, the one he'd gotten from a wire fence 16 years ago before she'd ever heard of this valley. And it struck her the way it sometimes did that they had arrived in each other's lives from completely separate histories, whole worlds of experience that had nothing to do with each other, and somehow landed here, in these two chairs, with the spring evening around them. Ruth, he said, and stopped. Then more carefully. I spent 2 years, after she died, thinking that whatever came next was just maintenance. Keep the ranch, keep the children, keep going. He paused. I didn't think there was going to be a next in the way there used to be a next. I thought that was done. She listened and let him have the space of it. I was wrong about that, he said. It came out simply, without drama. Just a man revising an earlier conclusion. She looked at him. He turned and looked at her, and in the long May light his face was open in the way it had been slowly becoming, and she thought about the first time she'd seen it, the closed and curtained quality, and how far it had come, and how much of that distance had cost him to travel. I know you came here for practical reasons, he said. So did I. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I know, but that's not... He paused, finding the words with the care he brought to things that mattered. That's not all it is. Not anymore, it hasn't been for a while. She looked at the meadow and then back at him. No, she said. It hasn't. I don't say things like this easily, he said, which was not a warning, just the truth of him, offered without apology. I know that too, she said. That's partly why they land the way they do. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face she recognized now as his version of warmth. Not demonstrative, not lavish, but real in the way that things are real when they come from someone who doesn't manufacture them. I'd like this to be permanent, he said. What we have here. I'd like it to be... He stopped, started differently. I'd like you to be my wife. Actually, not just in name. The evening was very still. Somewhere down the slope the creek was running, and the chickens in the yard had gone quiet, and the light was doing its last slow work on the grass. She looked at him for a long time. This man who had taken 7 months to travel from this is a practical matter to this porch and this question, who had never once asked her to be anything other than what she was, who had given her his account books and his fence lines and eventually his trust and ultimately this, the most undefended thing she'd seen from him. Yes, she said. He nodded once, the decisive nod, and then he reached out and covered her hand with his on the chair arm, and she turned her hand so her fingers were through his, and they sat like that in the last of the May light, without saying anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right then. Inside, Pearl appeared at the screen door, looked at them, and retreated with the elaborate casualness of a 7-year-old who has been watching more than anyone realized, Caleb coming in from the barn. 20 minutes later, found them still on the porch, and stopped at the foot of the steps and took in what he was looking at and said nothing for a moment. His face did several things in sequence. Then he said, I put fresh straw in the Callaway heifer's stall. January kept trying to eat the old batch. Thank you, Gideon said. Caleb looked at Eliza. His expression was not simple. Nothing about Caleb was ever simple, and she'd stopped wishing it were because the complexity was part of what made him who he was. Good, he said finally. One word directed at her, meaning several things at once. She understood all of them. Good, she said back. He went inside and she heard him talking to Pearl through the screen. Something about the drawing Pearl had been working on, his voice taking the particular tone he only used with his sister, which was softer and less defended than any other version of himself. And Gideon listened to it with the expression she'd learned was his contentment, which looked like stillness, but was actually something much warmer than stillness. The summer that followed was the hardest working and most alive she'd felt in years. The cooperative agreement among the Valley families had produced by July a formal trade arrangement with 3 settlements to the south, a direct consequence of the web routing deal, which had opened supply channels that the Valley had been blocked from, individually, for years. Eliza had negotiated 2 of the 3 agreements herself, at Gideon's side, and the third she had largely drafted on paper for him to deliver in person because his standing in the Valley was still different from hers, and she was practical enough to use that rather than resent it. The valley was changing, and it was changing because a collection of families that had been individually vulnerable had become, in the way that collections of things sometimes do, something stronger than the sum of its parts. Not unified, they argued, disagreed, competed in the ordinary ways that neighbors compete, but connected. Bound by the creek they shared and the agreements they'd signed and the memory of a winter that could have gone differently. Eliza knew, without false modesty and without excessive pride, that she had been part of why it hadn't gone differently. Not the whole of it. Gideon's willingness to stand up and lead, Caleb's knowledge of every inch of Black Hollow's terrain, even Pearl's small hand on her arm on the morning after the storm when the exhaustion had been very real. All of it had contributed to the chain of events that had changed the winter's outcome. She had been one link in it, but links matter. Without a single one, the chain is broken. She thought about this sometimes when she was doing the ordinary things. Hanging laundry, checking the herd, sitting with the account books in the evening. And she thought that the most important things in a life are rarely the dramatic ones. The night ride to Webb's compound had been necessary, and she'd do it again, but it was not the thing she was most proud of when she looked back at the year. What she was most proud of was smaller and less obvious. The fence she'd repaired her first week, alone, when she had no reason yet to believe anyone would notice or care. The cellar inventory, the herb bed she and Pearl had salvaged together on a cold afternoon in October. The conversation with Caleb in the barn about axe grips and saddle billets. The account books. The accumulation of practical, ordinary things that said, I am here. I am serious. This place matters to me. I will do the work. That was the argument she'd made, without knowing she was making it, from the first day to the last. Not with words, but with actions, which are the only arguments that hold up under the kind of pressure this valley had applied. She was not the same person who had climbed down from the Colton Wells stage with 43 cents and a bundle of letters, and nowhere else to go. She was not entirely different either. She still woke early and worked hard and preferred practical honesty to comfortable fiction. She still had the old habits of making herself small in spaces where she wasn't sure of her welcome, and she still caught herself doing it and had to correct for it consciously. She was still 18, 19 now, her birthday having passed in February in a winter so busy she'd barely marked it, until Pearl appeared at breakfast with a drawing of a cake, and Caleb had produced from somewhere a small jar of preserved peaches that were her favorite thing in the cellar. She was still learning Gideon, would be learning him for years, she suspected, because he was the kind of person who revealed himself slowly, layer by layer, and each layer was a different texture from what you'd expected. She was still learning the children, still learning the ranch, still finding the edges of what she didn't know and working toward them. That was not a failure. That was just what being somewhere real looks like from the inside. On an evening in late August, she stood at the top of the meadow slope with Gideon beside her and looked out at the valley. The light was that particular quality that August evenings have in the high country. Gold so saturated it almost has a sound to it, laying itself across the grass and the hills and the water of the creek below in a way that makes the world look briefly like the best version of itself. The cattle were visible in the north pasture, the herd that had been returned from the dark in January, now fat on summer grass. The barn roof, freshly repaired. The kitchen garden, Ruth's herb bed included. The sage and thyme and lemon balm brought back through the spring by Eliza and Pearl's patient work, visible from here, green and orderly. The porch railing, which Caleb had fixed in June without being asked, just appeared one day fixed, the way things in this family tended to happen. Survival brought you here, Gideon said, which was something she'd said herself once, though she didn't remember when she'd said it to him. I was looking out at the valley. Yes, she said. But that's not why you stayed. She thought about it the way she thought about things that deserved honest consideration rather than quick answers. Why had she stayed beyond necessity, beyond the practical calculus of having no better alternative? She could list the reasons. The work that had become hers, the children who had become people she loved in the uncomplicated way that happens when love sneaks up on you through ordinary days rather than arriving announced. But listing them didn't quite capture the essential thing. The essential thing was something about the difference between a place you sleep and a place you live in, between occupying a space and belonging to one. She had belonged to very little in her life. Her father's house, her uncle's ranch, both of them temporary, and both of them fundamentally other people's. and she had not fully understood, until she was here, how much of her energy had gone into managing the distance between herself and every place she'd been. The exhausting, continuous work of being a visitor. She wasn't a visitor here. She hadn't been for a long time. It became mine, she said finally. All of it. The work and the people and the difficulty and the land. It became mine and I became its, and that's not something you walk away from. He looked at her. The gold light was on both of them, and the valley was spread below, and the evening was very still. No, he said, it isn't. He put his arm around her, which he did with the same economy he brought to everything. Not tentatively, not with announcement, just a decision made and acted on. And she leaned into his side and looked out at what they'd kept and what they'd built, and what was still ahead of them, which was considerable, because a ranch and a family and a valley are not problems you solve. They're lives you live, one season at a time. Behind them on the slope, Pearl's voice drifted up from the direction of the house, calling something to Caleb, and Caleb's voice came back with the particular tone that meant he was answering his sister in the soft way he reserved for her. And Eliza heard it and felt it settle somewhere in her chest, the way things settle when they're in the right place. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 months ago, sitting on a cold porch step in the dark, crying the quiet kind of tears that are really just exhaustion, asking herself whether anything she was doing was working. She thought about how, if you'd told her then what August would look like, she might have believed it and might not have. Because hope when you're that tired is a complicated thing to hold. She was glad she'd held it anyway. Some things do not come to the people who are most deserving, or most prepared, or most obviously suited for them. They come to the people who keep showing up on difficult mornings and doing the next necessary thing and refusing, through stubbornness or pride or sheer ornery determination, to be the reason it falls apart. Eliza Mercer had come to Black Hollow Ranch with nothing but 43 cents and the willingness to stay. And the willingness to stay, in the end, turned out to be everything. The valley remembered her, not as a legend, not as a story that got cleaner in the retelling, but as a woman who had been genuinely difficult to discourage, and had built something real out of that quality, and the people who eventually stopped fighting it and started building alongside her. That was enough. That was in fact more than most people get. The light went amber and then violet, and then the first stars showed above the eastern hills, and Gideon and Eliza stood on the slope above the meadow, while the evening came down, and Black Hollow Ranch settled around them like something that had been waiting all along for exactly this. Not perfection, not the absence of difficulty, but two people willing to face both together. That was how it ended, and that was how it began.